So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the International Symposium from Adaptive Reuse to Adaptive Architecture. We're really thrilled to have you all here in Ottawa and online. We have about 300 people registered between those who are here with us in person and those who are on Zoom or YouTube. So I'm Federica Goffi. I'm a professor of architecture here at the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University, which is located on the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, ancestral, and unceded territory. So in about 15-20 minutes, we will give a brief introduction of the conference topic. But before we do that, we're going to have a number of welcome messages. And I'd like to first start by introducing my colleagues, Dr. Mariana Esponda, who has been fantastic. So she's the coordinator of the Conservation and Sustainability Program in our school, and she's done this for more than 15 years. So our other co-host is Dr. Mario Santana, who is a professor of engineering and architecture here at Carleton University. And he's also the UNESCO co-chair of Digital Twins at Carleton University. So, and I guess to get started, I'd like to invite Mariana to do the land acknowledgement for us. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going to explain. Our Carleton campus occupies unceded non-treaty Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Acknowledging this implies a commitment to transforming our spaces, programs, and practices through honorable and respectful engagement with Indigenous peoples. Land practices, land-based knowledges, and holistic approaches to architectural adaptability and urban design. With this event, we seek to engage with social, political, and environmental concerns, critically and considering how questions of adaptability may support our conversations, building a language and ecological care, collective well-being, sustainability, and especially reconciliation and social justice at the forefront. Thanks. So now I want to introduce Bettina Appel Kuzmarov. Please, can you come, please? Welcome, please. It is my pleasure to introduce Bettina. She is the Associate Vice President and Vice Provost, International Student Experience and Strategic Partnership here at Carleton University. In this role, Bettina promotes research excellence and fosters international mobility, contributing to Carleton's development of knowledge with long-term, real-world impacts. Before taking on this role, Bettina served as the chair of the Department of Law and Legal Studies, where she was a faculty member since 2006. She was also clerk of Carleton Senate and associate dean in the Faculty of Public Affairs. We are thrilled that Bettina is with us today. Please join me and welcome Bettina.
I'm going to do this, since for obvious reasons, podiums are never my friend. So I will stand here and welcome you all. First of all, on behalf of our Vice President, Research, Innovation, and International, Rafik Gubran, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. And I'm so glad to see all the scholars gathering today to discuss timely questions on issues of sustainability that pertain not only to the growing field of adaptive reuse, but also to the future of architecture as an adaptive practice and as an area of disciplinary study that is in constant evolution. Today, I'm pleased to welcome 5 keynote speakers, all renowned for their work in the field, who are joining this event. I welcome today the contributions of Dr. and architect Wanda de la Costa, who's joining us from Arizona State University, but who is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in northern Alberta, Canada. We're also welcoming architect Silbo McKenna, EVOQ Architecture, who is a Carleton alumna, so we'll claim that. Architect Hector Fernandez Alorza at HFE Architecture, who will be joining us from Spain. Dr. Rumiko Honda, Emeritus Professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and not but not least, Dr. Lillian Wong, Architect and Professor of Interior Architecture at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. Together with them, 101 scholars are going to present 72 papers dealing with case studies in 33 countries, including Canada. And that's just making me tired. So I wish the architectural historians and theorists, the conservation scholars, the doctoral researchers, designers, and practicing architects who join us at this 3-day event at Carleton to draw out meaningful connections between architecture, the qualities of sustainable environments, and as places that aspire to be socially just, inclusive, and equitable. I welcome you all.
Thank you so much, Bettina, and thank you so much for your support. And I know Bettina is not the first time that you have been talking about cultural heritage conservation, also from her legal background. So we're very thankful that you're here. So this event emerges as part of the activities organized in the context of the Social Science and Research Council grant, Quality in Canada's Built Environment Roadmaps to Equity, Social Value and Sustainability. I think the name of the grant has changed a lot. I remember in the beginning it was Quality of Architecture, but I really like this title, Jean-Pierre. Good job. So this partnership addresses the diversity of public environments and that impact the everyday life of millions of Canadians in urban spaces, buildings and landscapes, focusing on 4 research areas or clusters. 1, spatial justice and enhanced quality of life. 2, integrated resilience, material culture, and adaptive reuse, which is the one that we're here today. And 3, inclusive design for health, wellness, aging, and special needs. And 4th, processes and policies supporting the reinvention of built environments.
I would like to start by acknowledging our sponsors who really help us to make this project happen. So we also are supported by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Connection grant, but we're also supported by the Carleton Research Practice of Teaching Collaborative, the Carleton Immersive Media Studio, the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism, the Faculty of Engineering and Design, and Carleton University. And we are especially grateful to have received funding support from the Indigenous Focus Programming of the Carleton University Academic Staff Association. We would like to thank also our director, Anne Bordelot, who will join us at the closing of the event. Right now she is traveling. And we want to also wholeheartedly thank the wonderful team of Carleton students who are here around us and are going to be helping us for the next 3 days. We also would like to acknowledge the invaluable support of the Ottawa Regional Society of Architects, ORSA, and the chair, Christopher Moyes, along with Daryl Hood, and as well the Canada Association of Heritage Professionals, CAP, and its president, Adam Hatch, who I believe should be here with us or will be here with us. We are also indebted to the generous support of engineers John Cook and Lisa Nicol, respectively, founder and principal of John G. Cook Architects Associates. We also thank Routledge for a sponsorship for this event, and we're also starting to talk to them about the possibility of developing a publication out of this event. And so we will be in touch with you right after the event and ask you in terms of whether you are interested in being, considered for an additional peer review process. We'll arrive at the papers that will develop over a period of about a year into a book publications. So as conveners, we would also like to express our gratitude to 40 scholars worldwide who blind peer-reviewed the work that was selected for this event. And not last, we want to thank the Sprott Business School of Carleton University for hosting us here in the Nicol building. A special thank you goes to the Associate Dean, Rebecca Renfro, and Deborah Kasselman, Manager of Academic Operations. Along with them, we'd like to acknowledge the support of conference services at Carleton, and especially Sarah Adams, Abiba Mohamed, and Mika Villeneuve, and not last, Colin Elliott, right at the back, with his team from production services. So thank you all very much. And now just a few points about our activities here. So today, all the presentations will happen in this space. Tomorrow and the following day will be on the 4th floor. So we have 2 rooms, 4010 and 4020. All the keynotes and plenary sessions are in 4010. So coffee and lunches will be served during our breaks. We also have a speaker's dinner tomorrow night, and this is in Riverbank Social, which I think, in Richcraft Hall, like you can see there in the orange rectangle. And it's for those who have actually registered ahead of the event. And that's because, unfortunately, we have exactly 65 people booked, and that's, I guess, the capacity of the restaurant. And I guess this is just a note about how we're going to manage the presentation. So for the moderators, we're going to have very brief introductions, just the name of the speaker, maybe the affiliation and the title of the paper, because the bios are actually enclosed in the Book of Abstracts. And we're going to have, someone is going to help us, like one of the students is assigned to help us keep track of time. So all the papers should be exactly 15 minutes, and we really appreciate your understanding with that because of, a number of reasons, but primarily because there are quite a few speakers who are presenting on Zoom. Actually, our first session is going to be entirely on Zoom, as it happens. And so for those speakers, there is a time difference. So we want to be respectful of that, and also the fact that overall 300 people register for this event, and about 150 are online, and they might just tune in for specific presentations. So we would like to make sure that they get a chance to see them at the right time. And now I guess we can go ahead and introduce the conference topic. So over the course of 3 days, our international symposium brings together a diverse group of leading scholars and architectural practitioners from 33 countries who join us here in Ottawa and remotely to collectively advance our understanding of a potential paradigm shift from adaptive reuse to adaptive architecture. The current prevalence of adaptive reuse in the building industry marks a beginning, but it's not an end in itself. A radical cultural shift from adaptive reuse to adaptive architecture is necessary to move the field of architecture from a dominant culture of new construction towards a pervasive ethos of adaptability. Under this framework, every building or site, regardless of heritage status or age, could be approached through the dual lens of its present and future adaptability. The call for paper is born from our belief that adaptive architecture is a vital attitude towards the built environment, addressing global sustainability challenges. Despite current pedagogical trends, embracing a culture of reuse and recycling, architectural education still prioritizes new construction over remodeling and adaptation. Many of the papers that will be presented here will address new methodological approaches, recentering architectural design on adaptability questions. While academic literature on adaptive reuse and heritage practices is expanding rapidly, and many of you at this conference are actually leading contributors to this expansive body of critical work, many projects in the building industry still overlook the potential of existing contexts and adaptive practices. An in-depth global analysis of adaptability is needed to address the growing importance of adaptive technologies and practices for contemporary architects and engineers. Contemporary conservation theories emphasize the social, cultural, equitable dimensions of sustainability in urban renewal. This discourse is also enriched by exploring climate adaptation and deep retrofitting, as many of the papers will show. Adaptability often gives rise to conversion projects, recontextualizing ideas, details, or buildings along with their sites, forming projects within other projects, allowing us to re-enter a pre-existing reality anew, both physically and culturally. So with this in mind, we want to ask, can plural storytelling emerge when places adapt, contributing to an inclusive and diverse sense of cultural orientation for architectural adaptability? Conversion has the potential to generate hybrid narratives, articulated at the junctures and disjunctures of materials and stories. Existing buildings and new interventions inform one another through reciprocal adaptability. These recontextualizations have the potential to create stories of resilience, cultural memory, and social inclusion by allowing places to become nested sites of plural knowledge constructions. And now we can introduce our 6 themes, or what I like to call 6 radical shifts that we need to get there. So, and these are the session topics. So, radical shift number 1. So, from single authorship to multi-authorship. Design in the modern and contemporary Western world has led to an imbalance to preservation approaches that often limit the possibility of creative intervention in a historical context. At the same time, designers often do not view heritage buildings as likely canvases for their work. So we question, under what conditions could projects be conceived as open works, inspired by Umberto Eco's own notion? And how can architecture be designed for adaptability? And I'm referring here to new architecture, like how do we envision the future? So adaptable architecture from this perspective is not fixed by a dominant narrative or a single narrative. And as Umberto Eco said, quote, the work of art, and in our case we can say the work of architecture, gains its validity precisely in proportion to the number of different perspectives from which it can be viewed and understood, end quote. An authentic allographic architecture embraces change by welcoming multiplicity of authorship over time, moving away from the notion that the building is the result of a single act of design. This deliberate openness creates adaptable, inclusive spaces that invite diverse stories, reflecting the intertwined cultural, social, economic interests of everyone who interacts with the built environment. So you can go to our next. Number 2, from historical materialism to a culture of plural storytellings. Material conservation efforts are not sufficient to sustain a sense of place. Interventions in a historical context extend beyond compliance with conservation standards and guidelines, which are themselves transient in nature. Close-up readings in the particularities of place offer sighted insight into re-envisioning shared built environments in relation to land and context. Understanding the past as inventory can turn cities into museums. Yet we know that while the past is at work within the present, it doesn't fully coincide with it. Architectural stories are not the product of the accumulation of information, which produces an indexable material history to be preserved. Adaptability, I argue, is more akin to storytelling than historical materialism, if we consider, in particular, the writings of Walter Benjamin. The time lapse between transformation can create opportunities for multiple stories to emerge, manifesting diverse and at times conflicting perspectives, realizing contiguous imageries of past and future events, evoking and provoking a process through which memory traces surface and overlay. Radical shift number 3. From a culture of deadlines to a culture of beginnings. Presently, the architect's responsibility are timed by design and construction deadlines, and drawings are maintained as contractual work records for legislated liability periods. In contrast, an architect of record is seldom in place after construction, and the historicity of building is measured in linear time. However, adaptability exemplifies how architecture is only defined in and through a process of becoming. This approach can potentially substitute the current dominant imagination of endings, conservation as is, or single author design, essentially when buildings are born finished, with an imagination of multiple beginnings, where design alterations, multi-author design, take place over time. And now, radical shift number 4, from a culture of functionalism to a culture of conversion. It's inspired by the form follows function concept. Modernism, I guess, inspired by this idea, was not keen to consider conversion as a modality of creativity. Existing buildings were seldom the chosen site. Since the 1920s, according to Johannes Kramer and Stefan Breitling, the terminologies of conversion and conversion architect have been used to discredit the work of modernization in a historical context. So perhaps this is because conversion is still loosely defined as an idea of change of use, and we lack a deeper understanding of it as a form of material and cultural imagination. New buildings were often designed as finished objects for short life cycles, focusing on the individual creator rather than architecture as a product of multiple authorships, communities, sites, and time. These attitudes, I believe, makes architecture less apt to aging well, less inclusive, and less sustainable. Yeah. So number 5, from historical architecture to transhistorical adaptability. The Transhistorical Adaptability Project activates potential readings of architecture through interscalar temporal relations, nurturing a multi-chronic imagination within extended timeframes. From this perspective, the making of architecture is a slow, intergenerational phenomenon and an integral part of the architectural project. Architecture in this way could be conceived not as a finished product, but as an unfinished work, where economic, social, cultural, and real geopolitical contexts imply change. So, and the last one, which is, I believe, very important to our conference, is the question of how do we move from the pedagogy of renew to a pedagogy of adaptability. Even though the field of adaptive reuse has led to an encouraging shift in architectural pedagogies and has seen the establishment of many new master programs around the world, and many of you teach in those programs, architectural schools still predominantly focus on new construction. So we ask, which pedagogical approaches have been taken, experimented with, or still await implementation? So that concludes the introduction to the topic. Our first session, which is precisely on the topic of from the pedagogy of renew to a pedagogy of adaptability, it's entirely on Zoom. I'd like now to introduce the first session, and the first paper will be presented by Jhono Bennett, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and his co-author, Zachary Fluker, lecturer at the Bartlett's Urban Design Program, and Maxwell Mutanda, who is the co-founder of Studio Detail, a design research firm based in London, RR, and Cape Town. And their paper is titled Radical Repair, Reorienting Architectural Pedagogy Through Adaptive Making. The second paper, by Ashley Mason, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Sheffield in the UK, is titled Reassembling Future, the Potential of Reassembly Rooms in an Adaptive Architectural Pedagogy. And the third paper in this session, by Konstantinos Avramidis, who is an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Cyprus. It's co-presented with Phrixos Petrou, who is a PhD candidate in architecture from the same university. And the paper is titled Care, Repair, Adapt on an Eco-Feminist Frame Design Studio in Nicosia. So please join me and welcome our first speaker, who is launching the symposium from Cape Town.
So thank you very much. I'll be presenting on behalf of Maxwell and Zach. And first of all, thank you very much, Federica, for inviting us again, and Mariana and Mario for this wonderful opportunity. And I'd like today to share a collection of work that extends across the evolving pedagogy of Unit 2 at the Bartlett School of Architecture, where Zach, Maxwell, and myself have been teaching together for a few years now, which are looking around the ideas of repair, not only as maintenance and restoration, but as a broader adaptive, relational, and pedagogical framework. This presentation will also include snippets from our own doctoral work that I conducted at the Bartlett and how it's evolved towards my teaching here in Cape Town. So I really would like to put a sort of global north, global south. I know those terms are contentious, but that's the way that we're going to frame it, as well as my own practice work here in South Africa. So repair is often framed as something corrective, a response to damage. But in context like South Africa, shaped by inequality, colonial histories, environmental stress, and much infrastructural fragmentation, repair is rarely seen as clean or consensual. It is partial, negotiated, layered, and sometimes very uncomfortable. That discomfort is important because it shifts repair away from being something purely technical and towards something that is rather ethical, political, and brings into question large ideas of the ecological response that we have as humans in the Anthropocene. Much of the thinking that I'm talking about today come from these ideas of Southern scholarship, Southern urban scholarship, so Jennifer Robinson, Edgar Peterson, Abdul Malik Simone, Ananya Roy, and Gautam Ban. And these thinkers remind us that cities in the so-called global south are not incomplete versions of their northern counterparts, but they are themselves sites of innovation, negotiation, adaptation. Gautam Ban's work in particular talks about repair as a southern practice. And in South Africa and in London, we see this in our everyday context. Through much work in South Africa, through Zach's work in the UK and across Canada, Maxwell's work across Zimbabwe and the UK, we've seen that in highly unequal contexts, repair is not a special project. It's an everyday practice. Communities continuously repair systems that were never designed to support them socially, spatially, and infrastructurally. That reality fundamentally reshapes how we think about architecture and pedagogy. To ground these ideas, I'll briefly share a small project in an informal settlement in Denver, Johannesburg. Denver itself resists these categorizations, even though I mentioned it as an informal settlement. It's a site that sits between migrant labor histories, apartheid-era planning, tribal governance, and contemporary informality. Repair here is not a clean intervention. It's an ongoing collaborative maintenance shaped by inequality and the unfinished work of reparation in Johannesburg, which is still the most unequal city in the world. This brings me to a more difficult dimension of repair and how cities respond to that. What you're seeing on the slide now is the city of Johannesburg's response to the occupation of perfectly good building. And instead of trying to really address it, the response of the city has been to destroy these structures, evict the residents, and place them in what you're seeing on the right screen, these temporary relocation areas. This is more than 8 years old, and people are still living in these shacks. What is striking here is how these responses consistently fail to engage with the social ecologies, and are rather thinking of repair as an approach that new build, new construction, and destruction are the only ways of dealing with such difficulties. If eviction and displacement are treated as only technical solution, then repair gets collapsed into management, a way of restoring order rather than engaging with the injustice. This is where thinkers like Edgar Peterson and Abdul Malik Simone have been important in this regard. Repair here, through their framing, is not an outcome delivered by architecture or the state. It's a condition that we all work through, and we should be encouraging to engage with that. During my time at UCL in London, Zach, Maxwell, and myself have worked closely through an undergrad teaching studio, the UG2 at the Bartlett. The studio became a collaborative space where teaching, research, and practice overlapped around questions of adaptation, making, and repair. As students responded to the questions around climate crisis, circular economies, and adaptive reuse from a arguably Eurocentric context, the studio gave us space to ask what repair might mean pedagogically, not only technically, but socially and ethically situated around London and the students' stories within that. What emerged and is still emerging is a shared pedagogical position. Architecture is never really finished. Instead, it is continuously maintained, negotiated, repaired, and reshaped through collective processes over time. Building on these ideas of relational ethics and co-production, I'd like to shift to Cape Town here in a little town called Muizenberg, where I resituated this work in 2025. Students here were asking, what does care? What is repair? Who absorbs this in terms of context? This is where repair begins to shift from intervention towards attention. At this point, the student work is what I'd like to frame here. Importantly, we didn't ask the students to design reparative architectures. We asked them to sit with places that felt unresolved environmentally, socially, and to notice what repair might be doing in a city like Cape Town. Repair in this context is both material and relational. Students encountered everyday acts of maintenance already taking place. What kept water flowing, what managed waste, what repaired pathways, how did people navigate conflict, and how were spaces held together through what was called informal care. This is Kanya Celia's work, who approached repair through ritual memory and inherited ocean knowledge. The project draws from Khoisan tidal fish traps and practices of coastal ritual and belonging, and a site that has largely and long for the last 20th century been a whites-only area. For her, repair began thinking less about fixing and damage, but re-inscribing erased practices into the present landscape from a Black perspective. Building on personal memory and family ritual, Kanya Celia developed a constellation of spatial gestures that, rather than fixed buildings, thresholds, watchtowers of care, and spaces of collective safety, repair became about acknowledgement. What she ultimately proposed was not a solution, but a conversation with the landscape on the terms of what her process allowed for. Repair became an act of remembrance and refusal at the same time. Liam, a white South African student, began with the recognition of the coastline not as neutral ground, but as a site of unjust inequality. The Cape Flats and False Bay are shaped by forced removals, racial zoning, and conservation enclosures, alongside waste infrastructures, all legacies of apartheid spatial planning. Liam's work led him to propose adaptable and negotiable boundaries rather than fixed solutions. Repair here became about an architecture of negotiation that allowed for injustices to be reparatively addressed in the current context of Cape Town. Crucially, he situated himself and his own positionality in the landscape, drawing on June Bam Hutchinson's work around ethics and positionality. This way of approaching repair connected directly to how we understand architecture, where thinkers like Jonathan Hill and Bernard Rudolfsky remind us that architecture is always shaped through use, adaptation, and collective life. Moving to my own doctoral work, where repair was speaking much more about these ongoing practices of maintenance, I was reminded about Leslie Loco, who's now the head of the African Roots Institute, whose challenge to rethink architectural practice through plural, situated, and culturally responsive forms of knowledge production, rather than simply just buildings. And speaking to the work that we've been doing in one-to-one in Johannesburg, this idea that repair is not exceptional or heroic, it is something everyday, relational, and often invisible, and is inseparable from the histories of dispossession that shape South African cities. In places like this, that I'm sure many of the speakers here understand of history shaped by colonialism and their own forms of apartheid and inequality, repair cannot be understood without reckoning with what was taken, erased, or systematically denied. This way of thinking also shapes the way that we teach. Repair is considered not as a solution that students are expected to deliver, but a way of working, of paying attention, of recognizing care already underway, and understanding when intervention supports undermine those systems. Across the student works, my own practice, and the practices that Max and Zach will share, one thing becomes clear. Repair is a never a finished object. It is a process, maintenance rather than replacement, adaptation rather than optimization, care rather than control. Repair often opens a different conversation about value. Much of what sustains life, maintenance, emotional labor, informal knowledge remains invisible within architectural practice. Repair here foregrounds those hidden forms of value. Repair also forces a confrontation with positionality. Who names something as broken? Who is authored to repair it? And who bears the risk when repair fails? Seen this way, repair is pedagogical. It teaches us and our students to slow down, to sit with uncertainty, and to work with complexity rather than trying to erase it. It is also important to be clear about what repair is not. Repair is not a return to an ideal past. It's not a universal solution. And sometimes non-intervention may be more ethical than architectural response. I'll end where I began, without a definition. Rather than asking how we repair the city, perhaps we should ask, what does it mean to design in ways that allow new forms of care, responsibility, and relationality to emerge? Repair is not outside architecture. It is a way of engaging with our cities already function through everyday acts of maintenance, care, and adaptation. Repair requires knowledge infrastructures that make lived realities visible, legible, and actionable within our current spatial development systems. Repair becomes measurable through change in relationships between residents, services, and institutions, making sustainability social and politically real. In this case, repair speaks to architecture. Improving access to adequate housing requires a shift in how progress is measured, and views of cities across the global south and north not as these binaries, but as these relational centers to these formal and often Eurocentric ideas of what it is to engage. Repair becomes measurable through changes in relationships between residents, services, and institutions, making sustainability socially and politically real. Thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge those that have contributed to this work and to access their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jhono, for the wonderful presentation. So we have two students that have mics. I think we have one on one side and one on the other. And so at this time, we could ask the audience in the room if you have any questions. And I don't know if there is any question on Zoom, and if you're monitoring those, maybe you can let us know. So while you think about your first question, maybe I can start. So I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask all of you is really about how to engage community, you know, and communities in the right way, and thinking about the timeline of a studio versus the timeline of an engagement with a community. And you, for example, Costantino spoke about 3 years of engagement. So I wanted to ask all of you to reflect on that and how you work with students pedagogically. How does the project evolve, you know, semester after semester? And eventually, you know, what are the results both for the students in their given time and the communities potentially in these longer periods of engagement?
I can jump in just because I went first, I guess. I think this is a really good question. And I mean, the first thing, and anyone that's worked with me knows that I always bring this up, but I think this idea, at least in South Africa, I can't speak outside, besides maybe London, is that when we use the term community, I'm always a bit cautious. You know, like if 5 people struggle to decide what they want for dinner, how can 5,000 people decide what they want for the next 50 years? And I often wonder who gets to decide what is a community versus accepting that there are often many communities within a spatial grouping of people. And at least in South Africa, this term often is a euphemism for basically poor people who are not white. You know, there's no white communities. Well, there are, but like, that's not what we mean when we say that. I also recognize that it's an in-term community as well. Like, it's used to help people motivate and socialize and get sort of advocacy towards things. So I'm not saying not to use it. I just think the question is, who do we really mean in our various contexts when referring to the community? And I think in South Africa, the sort of histories of racial inequality and the legacy of the colonial project reinforces that. And it sort of wants us to think of at least groupings of people who are not white and this old rural idea of people in a remote village, and therefore they all want the same thing. And when we must design for this imaginary grouping of unity and cohesion as if they are super people. And in fact, they're obviously complex and they have their own challenges. So for me, I think the question is to speak to, when we're setting up projects as teachers, is what do we mean in that context? How do we identify leadership? How do we work through different groupings of community, whether it's residents or church groups or faith groups or businesses or, you know, all of these things. And I think often what happens, I think if we don't do that, is that the architectural response is to design a community center, which again becomes a sort of non-project. But it's a good political project. So I think it's about those questions and then asking ourselves, what is our relationship? What are we able to do? What does it mean when we eventually leave? And how do we make these understandings explicit and negotiable, and to be able to be called in at any point? Because obviously the power dynamics in South Africa at least are very real. And what we've been doing at least is just trying kind of forms of MOUs, of building in multiple checkpoints and trying to build these transparencies in our work. And it's not a perfect practice. I think it's a lot of labor and mistakes and getting things wrong and being able to like, ironically, repair relationships. And I think that's all we've been able to offer in terms of the methodology of engagement. It's just that sort of careful cautioning of setting up, that careful engagement of doing, and then that very careful process of eventually leaving and being okay with that, because we, you know, there's a bigger careers and projects, and we have to be honest about that, I think.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Really just to kind of build on that, I think a lot of it comes down to kind of trust and kind of brokering those relationships as well. We benefited immensely, I think, from the libraries being kind of so entangled with the ongoing research, which we've been fortunate to receive funding for. So that enabled us in a way to kind of make sure that although the live projects themselves only last 6 weeks. Through the research project, we were able to kind of maintain those relationships and keep them ongoing for a little bit longer. But I agree, definitely, it's definitely a case for making transparent the kind of remits that we have, the limitations, what we can and can't do, and being quite open and transparent about that with the people that we're kind of working with. And I guess relying on their kind of trust as well, that they can kind of buy into what we're able to do and not do. Live projects as well, they've been ongoing for like over 25 years now, and again, that's been a real a case for, again, ongoing engagement and making the kind of the work that other live projects have done as well visible. And again, just about building that kind of trust in the institution as well, which often doesn't kind of necessarily broker trust, but making sure that the kind of institutional distances that you might normally expect, because we've been working with communities for a number of years now, we've been able to kind of build those relationships over time and continue to maintain them. I agree, yeah, it's definitely a case of being quite honest, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, if I would, thank you for this, Federica. It's a really interesting question. I agree, and I would echo Jhono in relation to, communities more often than not are more imagined rather than real. So they belong in our imagination, how we appreciate them, and also the bias that we bring as we approach them should be also acknowledged. For instance, in our case, the mere fact that there are strong bonds in the refugee states, and this has to do with historical reasons, which had to do with their refugee identity, and also half a century that they have spent there. Of course, they demographically change over time, especially over the past few decades, but still there are still bonds, and they're relatively small in scale. And when you, there might be contacts already from the student side or from other sides. So we do have people that we actually know in the States. And then the one person, introduced the next, we also had the opportunity and the privilege for them to allow us spend time with them, and they opened their houses to us. They were more than willing to share their stories with us and their routines, which were taken into account, but also their challenges, because the estates are, at least in most cases, in a bad shape, and so the challenge that they had to face, they've been sharing with us, and they were taken into account, but also, spending time with them, and over the years, we managed to build trust, as Ashley mentioned, and being able to communicate what we are doing there, rather than being extractive or exhaustive of their, intelligence, as I mentioned, because there is a sort of a spatial intelligence, except for, the mnemonic capital, and the spatial practice is literally a design intelligence already happening there, which we want to acknowledge and give justice when we come back with proposals which are shared with them, and also this also contributes as a project to the socialization and the destigmatization of the estates as, poorly architecturally executed housing estates to something that has actually an actual value.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all very much. There is a question from Mariana Esponda.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think that was a really good opportunity to see different examples on very different contexts. So my question will be, like in your opinion, which was the biggest challenge for the students to integrate that relationship with the community, but also the main challenges that they were doing during the project?
I could go first if you're okay. Thank you for this, Mariana. And actually, yesterday we had our review here of the studio, and it was something that we were discussing with the students. What was the main challenge? The main challenge was for them to slow down and not to rush it too quickly to reach a proposal. So the first bit, the first part of the studio, which is this exhaustive or careful engagement with the estate, with something that is not compelling as an environment, with people that might not even speak your own language and might have different ways of living, all these contradictions, and how to literally slow down the process and don't move too quickly to the actual projects. That was what our students themselves shared with us, that it was one of the key issues. So for them to slow down and actually see the value of not thinking that they're in this community, in this space to respond and give solutions in something that is problematic, but to actually learn by slowing down and paying careful attention to what exists and to the intelligence that bears and comes with it. That's, I think, that's what they also shared with us over the couple past few nights, which culminated yesterday at the final review.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Is there anyone else who would like to contribute to that question?
I can offer a couple of observations that the students we worked with shared with us. First was around language, particularly dealing with climate change. There's a lot of kind of technical jargon that kind of comes along with that. So the students initially kind of shared the kind of struggles around how do you actually just communicate between what the issues that the community are facing, which could be to do with energy issues, whether they can afford a light bulb, for example, but they might not necessarily relate to talking about climate policy. So they devised their own kind of methods for, as they kind of tend to being able to have some soft spaces for hard conversations, and really devising ways that they could disentangle these kind of conversations. And I guess related to that, and Konstantinos kind of mentioned it, this idea of kind of the temporal element. So how do you not only start those conversations, but keep people kind of engaged long enough that you kind of dig a little bit deeper and actually understand the issues from a more, from a deeper perspective, rather than just kind of skirting across the surface of things, so that you can actually kind of think about what kind of opportunities there might be for future actions. So yeah, those are the two kind of things that kind of stand out as being things that they devise ways of kind of overcoming in their projects.
Thank you. So I don't know if there is any other question. I do have one, but if you want to raise your hand, we'll know. Oh, there is one here. Okay. So.
Just a small question. My name is Marco Sosa, and I'm a professor, associate professor at Said University in Abu Dhabi. It's regarding, did you get a chance to, and it's for the three of you, did you get a chance to communicate, whether it's your findings or your data collection, with the local municipality or local councils, or somebody that's kind of policymaker or some sort of advisor or local parish head? Anyway, just wondering.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that, and this is part of the challenge actually to the previous question is that when the systems are so broken or not functioning, where do you place yourself as an architecture student or as a practitioner and as a teacher in response to that? So to this question of local council, local government, I think we make it all about, I'm sure each of us have our own relationships to that, but for example in South Africa, the council is only one of the stakeholders that often has the least amount of agency or power to really make any change. And I think that the question of then where you place the value of design or the process of participation and inclusion of a group of people becomes really important to ask and understand for them what local government engagement means. So my first project was a student project, and we were very lucky that the people we worked with knew exactly what to do with us and how to politically maneuver us to get what they needed in terms of services and service allocation. And then subsequently, I think that's the thing that we kind of always ask is what do the leadership that we're working with, and what do the leadership want to do with that type of engagement and how we do it? Because often, if the local government is involved, they don't really have the power. And I'm sure that's similar to each of you in this different context.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in relation to, particularly, I guess, the kind of second live project, so the Energy Hub was actually a kind of collaboration, if you like, between actors, one of which being the kind of local council. And they were, in a way, actively aware, I guess, of the work of the Energy Hub. And the live project as well. And actually, as part of the kind of close of the live project, and this is just one live project, there's actually kind of series of different live projects that kind of take place at the beginning of the year. And as a kind of collective, they then gather and present all of that kind of projects. And for this year, it actually took place in the local town hall. So that was, I guess, a kind of direct way of kind of showcasing the kind of work that not just this live project, but all the live projects have been doing, but locally. The ongoing Climate Assemblies project as well is very much engaged in kind of climate politics. So yeah, in that sense, there's an ongoing kind of dialogue there.
Thank you, Ashley.
Oh,
All right, I don't know if there is any additional questions. Otherwise, I will have, I guess, a closing question. I'm curious, like, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that all your studios are in the design curriculum of an architecture school. So I would like to know a little bit more about the curriculum in terms of where the studio sits and how, how the students, how prepared they are for this type of curriculum, how it's situated within your schools. When the students get to that point, is this the first experience working with communities? Is there more happening in the school? Are there other courses that help them prepare for this? Or do you do, you have to do a lot of the work of really shifting the way that they think in terms of the design approach, as you have explained?
Not for the kind of status at the University of Sheffield. My project is actually, it's the first kind of 6 weeks of the master's program. And it operates both across what we call year 5 and year 6. So that there's actually kind of a mixed group of different sort of levels of master's students. And those that are in stage 6 can actually sort of in a way support, because they've done it the kind of previous year, they could support the kind of new kind of intake of students. So there's a kind of interesting kind of relationship there. But yeah, it's very much, the kind of school's kind of quite known for being kind of sort of addressing kind of civic and social responsibility. And yeah, it kind of, it's a good kind of setup for that kind of approach to architectural education, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
In our school, this builds up in terms of participatory methods. So they do have another module happening, especially in the 4th semester. Our studio is on the 8th semester. And so they come much more prepared. But they also have several other modules which are related to refurbishment, if you may, etc. But maybe it's the first time that they engage in when these things come together, maybe. So it's participation, it's ethnography in more detail, engaging with the community, proposals for adaptive architecture, so on. So these bits, and maybe the adaptive bit is being introduced at that point. Maybe too late, maybe too soon, I don't know. But yeah, but there are steps that are being taken earlier in the school, although it is a we're relatively small school. We have our year is approximately 30 to 35 students only.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Jhono?
I'd like to ask Maxwell to answer this one. Maxwell, you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so they are design courses, both from Jhono's experience in Cape Town.
Yeah.
I've also taught on that. It's a postgraduate architectural course, which is seen as the first year of a master's, and it's sort of like a year-long design studio, which allows for continual development with the same tutor and student relationship. At the Bartlett, it's across 2 years, which is a vertical design unit of 2nd and 3rd years, and it's also a design-led course.
Thank you very much. So I guess this concludes the session. So thank you to all the presenters for sharing your research and your work in your schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. It's really, great to have, a conference in architecture and everybody's on time. I'm not being sarcastic. Okay, so for the next session, we are going to be talking about from a use of culture, functionalism, to a culture of conversion. And we have 4 groups of speakers. And this group of speakers are across the world. So our first group is from Colombia. Our second group is coming, the second and third group are coming from Portugal and Angola. And the last one is coming from Bangladesh. All right, so our first speakers from Universidad Piloto de Colombia is, I think it's María Patricia, right, that is talking. And I will let you introduce yourself and the topic, okay? So.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to thank Federica, Mario, and Mariana, and Carleton University for this invitation and for creating this space where we can come together, learn, and also share our experience. This presentation is part of this conference from Adaptive Reuse and Adaptive Architecture, which for me is really about shifting how we think about architecture. Not as something finished, but something that continues to change over time. In my case, I'm looking at this from an indigenous perspective, working with the Nazapáez people in the Toribío Reserve, the reservation in a rural region in Colombia. In this context, architecture is not just building, it's something alive. It connects to memory, to care, and to community life. I would like to, before moving forward, I would like to briefly situate myself and situate my work. I'm not indigenous, but as a Colombian architect and researcher, I deeply respect and admire the relationship that indigenous people have with territory and collective life. This is what inspired my PhD research at McGill University, focused on vernacular architecture and its philosophical approach, rooted in ancestral traditions and understanding of architecture as living place. It also connects with my postdoctoral work at Université de Montréal, where I had the opportunity to collaborate in the academic coordination of the project Quality in Canada's Built Environment, led by Professor Jean-Pierre Chupin. And also this experience allowed me to understand and to learn about the work that Carleton is doing. So it really get myself in this theme of adaptive reuse strategies. Also, the NASA-PAES community territorial approach to architecture directly relates to my research work in Colombia at the School of Architecture at Pilote Columbia University through the Cohabitat Research Group. This is a group where the people, the NASA-PAES people, is actively participate, and a research group that I represent today on the name of my colleagues that are attending online. So to understand this work, let me take you to the territory where this research is grounded. So the title of the conference is Endogenous Maternity and the Conversion of Indigenous Architecture. So this research begins with a very simple but important question. And as you can see here on this slide, how can indigenous architecture help us rethink sustainability today? And this question really guides everything that follows. In architecture, in general, sustainability is often focused in technical terms. But for the NASA-PAES people, sustainability is understood through memory, care, and continuity. So architecture is not only about building houses. It's about protecting life and sustaining relationships between people and territory. As I mentioned, this work takes place in Toribío, a rural area in northern Cauca, Colombia, within the indigenous territory of the NASA-PAES people. This is a rural reservation, far from main cities, close to the Pacific coast, and located in the Andes Mountains. Access here is difficult due to challenging terrain and ongoing violence caused by drug trafficking and guerrilla groups. The NASA-PAES people live surrounded by this conflict. So for centuries, they have defended this territory against external forces. For these people, territory is understood through the concept of Nasakiwe. Nasakiwe in their language means the great house. Because of this, architecture becomes much more than a shelter. Building a traditional house also means protecting culture, defending autonomy, and preserving territory and autonomy. As you can see here in this map, the NASA territory is not just a fixed place. It is a network of landscapes. It is a network of communities and relationships across the territory. And something very important here is that architecture is not static. Architecture moves around the territory. It expands across the landscape. So through the traditional house, the NASA yacht, the community makes its presence visible. It becomes a way of expressing and sustaining the indigenous voice across the landscape and becomes a peaceful voice in this conflict territory. So the house is not just a house. It is a part of a larger system that sustains life, but also is a political strategy. So the traditional house protects territory. So we see in this slide how the small houses, the traditional houses on top, and how they move through the territory. So each house that is built in this territory is a voice, it's a peaceful voice. It's a voice that represents the indigenous presence in this territory. So somehow, this architecture shows outsiders that these lands belong to the NASA-PAES people, and it's a symbol of ownership. The concept of the Nasakiwe territory is here represented in this slide. So here, the territory is understood as Nasakiwe, the great house. It brings together space, spirituality, politics, and everyday life. So architecture is part of this large system. And here we begin to understand the main concept of the title of this presentation, which is endogenous maternity. And I think this image is very powerful. This is a photo that I took in this reservation. It's a photo of a mural in Toribío. It's on a facade where indigenous women used to gather. And it says, indigenous woman is resistant. We defend life, we reject war. Peace is not built with the force of weapons, but with the power of words and wise actions. It is in Spanish, but I translated for this presentation. And it's powerful because it visually connects the idea of care, life, and territory, especially through the figure of woman body and motherhood. So this leads to the main concept, endogenous maternity. And this image reflects that idea. The image connects care, life, and territory. So endogenous maternity helps us understand architecture as a process of care. It is how communities protect life, transmit knowledge, and reject violence. So this slide brings together the four main concepts. And again, visually, you can see how they are connected. This is organized around the four core concepts that explains this idea of endogenous maternity. So the first one is the one that I just explained, and it describes the relationship between habitat care and social reproduction. The second is conversion, understood as transformation without losing territorial roots. The third is Nasakiwe, the great house, the territory which brings together land, life, spirituality, and politics. And the fourth is material memory, which refers to knowledge is embedded in materials and construction practices. So together, the concepts help us understand architecture not only as something physical, but as something deeply cultural and political. So as we see, endogenous maternity at the center. This is not a linear system, but everything is interactive. So we can begin to see those ideas more clearly through the architecture itself. In this slide, we see the nasayat, which is the traditional house. And at the center, in each traditional house, is always a fire. So the image shows how this territory is lived. The 3 stones inside each house represent generations, and the fire brings people together. So here they get together, they create community, and develop strategies for protection. So this is how the knowledge of construction and building houses is transmitted. So the fire is the center of the house, is the center of the territory. It is the most important place to connect the Nasapais people with their territory and with their culture. Here we see the material memory in practice. You can see both the construction process and also the materiality itself. The bareque or mud walls, the wooden structure, and also the community getting together to build their houses and build their nation. So material memory is not only about materials, it's about people building together, not only houses, but the entire culture. Traditional techniques like bareque are not only practical solutions, they are also expressions of resistance. As mentioned before, each traditional house built in this territory is a visible and peaceful voice of indigenous belonging to this territory. So architecture becomes a shelter and also an archive, because the voice of elders, the voice of the people, the voice of women passes from one generation to another and protects against outsiders. So this understanding helps us move in the idea of conversion. Here we see conversion and adaptative reuse. And I really like how this slide shows the different stages. As you see here, the house grows over time. It expands to protect and establish a presence in the territory. New spaces and new fires appear as family grows. So architecture adapts but keeps its identity. So this is adaptative reuse as evolution. Conversion here is not about replacing something old with something new. It's about transforming without disconnection. This image is also very significant, this one. It shows the role of women in this process, the maternity that I mentioned at the beginning. It shows women as central to the whole system. They are the guardians of the heart. They are the guardians of the fire and knowledge. They teach, they care, and they build houses and sustain community. So architecture is not only about form, it's about motherhood through the relationships and everyday life. So in many ways, women sustain architecture over time through relationships with people and the land. And this slide compares the two models of architecture, and it's like what they call the colonial design. One slide shows the modern architecture, which focuses on objects and form. So the NASA Paz people model focuses on relationships. So, but what is important here is not just to see the difference between one or the other, but it's how the NASA Paz model integrates everything into one system centered on relationship. Because what we see here is very different from modern architecture logic. Modern architecture often focuses on form and efficiency, but here in the NASA Paz concept, the starting point is that endogenous maternity, which is relationships with people and the protection of land, integrates the whole architecture. And in this slide, we can see an example of how architecture becomes an intercultural bridge. The image shows the rural Spanish Republican heritage and the indigenous architecture, and these contrasts help us understand the challenge. So the house becomes a connector, a mediator. And in this specific reservation, architecture mediates between identity and external presence, showing their traditional architecture and ways of build. Finally, this image brings everything together, how the concept of endogenous maternity makes presence by community, construction, territory, and daily life. We see images that are lived in this territory, and it shows not only the construction, but also how culture through the rituals and the spirituality can connect also with the construction system that they are proposing in this reservation. So they show that architecture is not an object, but a living system, and propose endogenous maternity as a way to rethink architecture and protect the NASA Paz people. And in this slide, conversion in this sense is not rupture, it's continuity. And this is where this concept connects directly with this conference, because architecture invites us to move beyond reuse as a technical solution, but to understand architecture as an ongoing process. And this is my final slide. I think I'm on time. So before I finish, I would like to end with this image. This is an architectural student project from Universidad Pilote, Colombia, developed in this territory. And I think it is very meaningful because it shows how the ideas that I present in this presentation move into practice and inspire new generations of future architects and future professionals. So what we see here is continuity, not replacing tradition, but working and adapting. So this is not only about understanding indigenous architecture, but also respecting others. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria Patricia. Really, very engaging research. So our second paper is going to be presented by Maria Tavares from the Faculty of Architecture and Arts of Lusíada University, North Portugal.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here at this symposium to present the paper entitled Low-Income Housing in Portugal, from a culture of construction for all to a culture of adaptability for all. In this essay, entitled In the Flow, the philosopher and art critic Boris Groys reflects on the rheology of art. As rheology is a scientific study of all types of fluids and the phenomenon of fluidity in general, in the context of art, it is important to understand how it resists the flowing passage of time. The present analogy is of interest as a point of departure for reflection on a significant corpus of low-income housing projects produced in Portugal during the 50s and 60s, programmed by a public organization and guided by modern urban and architectural principles. This presentation proposes to reflect on how, 75 years later, these supposedly less noble housing communities are now consolidated and accepted as successful examples and engages with the fluidity of time. And how did it all begin? In the late 90s, we began a study based on these two almost contemporary neighborhoods. The one on the right, in an urban context, is characterized by a high level of social homogeneity associated with the ideal of the Untitled Chapter, marked by a new urban image, strongly zoned and dominated by large, spaced-out housing blocks with a refined, purely rational design. The one on the left consists of a group of small houses built from scratch for rural workers adjacent to a chapel. The project, organized through the village People's House, was notable for its strong emphasis on community life. The proposals are the work of two distinguished Portuguese architects, but were promoted and built by a public organization whose architectural department was led by the architect Nuno Teutónio Pereira. Nuno Teutónio Pereira is widely regarded as one of the most distinctive expressions of the originality of the 20th century Portuguese modern architecture. Furthermore, he has consistently been a vocal supporter of architecture's role in serving the public interests from both cultural and social perspectives. His life has been characterized by a persistent struggle for citizenship, which encompasses the right to all rights, including the right to the city. Moreover, his legacy, consistently shared across multiple generations of collaborators, functioned as an institution of architectural and freedom thought. His career and his professional and civic legacy continues to this day fluid and timeless. Moreover, it was from him that we learn about what the project shown in the previous slide meant in the context of residential architecture in Portugal for the less privileged classes. The question we have always asked, ever since we met him and realized his role in social committed architecture, is what are these projects designed and built in mid-20th century Portugal by committed architects, and what is their relevance to contemporary thought? To achieve this answer, we have been involved in several projects that have established a guiding light for this architectural and its relationship with the project context. This relationship has been established not only in the rationalization of the housing unit, the mechanization of the construction process, or the normalization of elements, but also in the need to understand new forms of collective living. Moreover, it was with the publication of our interview with Teutónio Pereira that we clarified the practical effectiveness of the responsibilities he held. I'm sorry. In the 40s, the debate surrounding housing in Portugal took on significant proportions. The rural exodus led to a substantial increase in the number of families in poor housing, forcing the state to take measures to address the problem. 20 years later, although the problem persists, there was a perspective of social transformation in the country being driven by a new generation of architects, the same one that Teutónio Pereira belonged to. Habitações Económicas, Federação de Caixas de Previdência, or in English, translation, a direct translation, Affordable Housing Federation of Provident Funds, was a semi-public organization that focused on the study, promotion and construction of low-income housing in Portugal. For 26 years, Habitações Económicas has financed, promoted and the design and construction of affordable rent housing in Portugal using Provident funds, at the same time as a culture of change led by a new generation of social committed architects. The use of Provident Funds capital over more than 20 years of work by the Habitações Económicas generated a debate and reflection on housing, testing a new research territory and adapting to an economically constricted reality. by reducing the proposed domestic structures to their essentials. The new organization, which was still small in scale, was setting out on its new course by implementing standardized projects, first in Lisbon and supported by a range of social facilities, and then on small scales across the country, in direct opposition to the principles that guide Teutónio Pereira's humanistic vision. However, at the beginning of the 50s, Teutónio Pereira himself proposed for the city of Braga, in the north of the country, what is identified as the second phase of the organization, as it was the first project to depart from the standardized design circulating throughout the country. As part of a commitment to integrate the urban structure, the new affordable housing units in Braga offer an alternative to the headquarters standard layout. The design of these units maintains continuity with the existing urban structure while breaking out of a closed urban grid. And the proposal suggests a transition from a compartmentalized conception of space to a more integrated approach, embracing social responsibility as a commitment to the modern movement's formalisms. Numerous proposals follow. In a more urban context, we highlight the Ramal residential unit in Porto, designed by the architect Fernando Távora, with its parallel blocks separated by green areas and a distinctly rationalist style, where the principles of the Athens Charter are clearly evident. Or another proposal by Teutónio Pereira, in which the vertical circulation element serves as a key feature throughout the entire complex, providing small, elevated walkways to access the dwellings. Given their size, it was necessary to consolidate various functions to improve the efficiency of daily living routines. The inclusion of an isolated block in a plan of this nature was also tested for the first time, enabling all the units to play an important role in the overall composition. Moreover, in an area south of Lisbon characterized by intensive industrial development, Vítor Figueiredo proposes a self-contained housing complex that has strong impact on the local territory. Lessons from abroad. In the late 50s, Nuno Teutónio Pereira and Nuno Portas made an unusual journey through post-war residential architecture. They traveled across Europe to experience different approaches to housing. They made visits to Spain and Italy, seeking to understand the social and economic structures in the post-war period and the responses of the authorities responsible for the housing sector. In a decade of authors committed to participating in a process of social transformation, searching for new directions, the two Portuguese architects faced with the housing deficit that was being felt in Portugal, brought back from the journey a set of modern references that inevitably became a kind of argument to be put into practice, although with an equally inevitable critical reassessment. The presence of Nuno Portas distinguished the visit, a recent addition to the Nuno Teutónio Pereira practice, and someone with a deep understanding of conditions outside Portugal. The young architect, with his restless spirit and intellectual curiosity, had begun at an early age to explore the issue of collective and low-income housing as part of a commitment to the people. Participation was the keyword, and housing for the masses was the main focus of his research. The trip would thus allow him to experience firsthand the projects he had been carefully analyzing in the international magazines that reached the hands of Portuguese architects and to which they were not indifferent. One of the main aims of the visit was to gain first-hand insight into the work of Ina Casa, an organization similar to the Habitações Económicas. There were many lessons to be learned, particularly regarding the impetus provided by a generation motivated to experiment with a renewed approach to architecture that remained close to the working classes and was easily understood by them. But there were other significant lessons to be learned on this trip as well. The energetic architect Nuno Portas was responsible for the renewed Portuguese magazine Arquitetura, wrote a letter to Carlos Scarpa requesting a meeting in Venice. Scarpa devoted 2 whole days to them. Among other works, he showed them the major new projects still under construction at the time of the visit, the Olivetti store in St. Mark's Square. The project confirmed the possibility of moving beyond a kind of stereotype that no longer made sense in Portugal, giving the new direction the young architects were aspiring to. A kind of re-examination of modernity, deeply rooted in craftsmanship and attention to detail. The result of this two-day visit in the company of the Italian architects led, upon their return, to a complete article in this magazine, Arquitectura, a summary of the consequences of this journey. In rural areas, the same legislation regarding affordable rent housing was widely applied. Proposals are beginning to place an increased emphasis on living experiences, suggesting new ways of living. We highlighted the project by Teutónio Pereira for Barcelos, where knowledge of the beneficiaries provides a further area for research. New housing schemes were being tested, focusing on simplifying the program by concentrating functions in a central core that serves as the art of domestic life, strongly influenced by vernacular versatility and in direct connection with the outdoor environment. Local materials were also used as the expertise of local artisans who knew how to work with them. The tile roof provided the finishing touch to the articulation of the volumes, which deliberated combined vernacular construction with modern technologies and rational spatial planning with practical functionality without any abstract preconceptions. The same applied to the proposals requests from the Habitações Económicas through the People's House. The high level of involvement by local communities who were in direct contact with the architects result in a design that closely reflects the user's needs and placed a higher value on them. The situation is clearly evident in this case in the north of the country, in a deeply rural area. In addition to the heart of the dwelling, the kitchen, playing a key role in the functioning of the house, the accommodations for animals have not been ignored either. Or, in these two examples by Vítor Figueiredo, among many others, where he experiments with different scales promoted by the same organism. The concept of adapting a response to the environment and to reality in keeping with the local tradition without compromise to the picturesque, the folkloric, and the rustic. Just a quick note on the design of the standard housing unit for Peniche by the same architect, highlighting the lavoro, a non-functional space, yet an important one in the house that had to be small and affordable. The organism also permitted the construction of houses for fishers. Vítor Figueiredo, in his relentless pursuit of realism, proposes housing developments that foster a strong sense of community. And meanwhile, in the city, large-scale projects were being designed by the same architects, who were always driven by a desire to improve housing standards for the disadvantaged classes, in this case, by involving visual artists in the project design. 75 years later, what remains? We have compiled a survey of all urban, rural, and fishers' housing states, totaling around 21,000 dwellings. From an early stage, the Habitações Económicas expressed the desire to address the housing problem through the construction of collective housing, not only for obvious economic reasons, but also as an expression of modernity. This architectural approach has persisted over time and has become a point of interest for the architectural profession, particularly in its own era, confirming that this entire process contributed to the elevation of that very professional class through architecture as a tool for social recognition. And 75 years later, this architecture remains in use, adaptable to new circumstances and resilient to the fluidity of time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to invite everyone, after we finish with the presentations, to sit here, and we will have a round of questions. So our third speaker is Yolana Lemos. Hi, Yolana. Okay, the floor is yours.
Hi. Well, good afternoon, everyone, again. My presentation today aims to think about the future of various colonial buildings that are currently in a state of neglect in Angola, particularly in Luanda, and especially the cinemas found throughout the country. Luanda is the capital of Angola and today stands upon a complex web of historical continuities, and its urban fabric reflects the tension between the past and the demands of the present. In the center of this city, we find a colonial built environment, now appropriated by the Angolan population, or in certain cases, abandoned. In Luanda, the architectural landscape exists in a state of countless overlaps with buildings from various historical periods, finding it extremely difficult to dialogue with each other. From an architectural perspective, the colonial period in Angola was marked by buildings of undeniable architectural merit, especially during the introduction of modernism to the country. From the 1950s onwards, architectural practice in Angola underwent a transformation, giving rise to modernist buildings designed by Portuguese architects who were also influenced by Brazilian modernism. They began to develop an architectural language that responded to the region's conditions. However, we cannot discuss these buildings without also understanding colonial policy, in which tools were used to replace or erase local philosophies and cultures. In architecture, the models constructed in Luanda reflected the imposition of European philosophy of living and understanding the city. This way of living contrasted to the daily life of the native people. So the urban dichotomy of the time contributed to an understanding of social division. First, the city center, also referred as the asphalt city, was reserved for the European elite and a group of Africans classified as assimilated because they spoke Portuguese and adopted a culture more similar to European culture. And we have the massive outlying neighborhoods with their self-building houses. They were home to most of the African population. These outlying neighborhoods in Luanda came to be known as Museke, and we still call them that today. The war for Angola's independence and the subsequent civil war contributed to a massive migration of the Angolan population to the capital, leading to overcrowding in these residential buildings in Luanda and rushing their deterioration. At the same time, today there is a systematic neglect for public buildings from the colonial period. And Angola's reconstruction since the end of the armed conflict in 2002 was often viewed optimistically from a political perspective due to its fast urbanization. The government prioritized some specific external and out-of-context models that respond to economic pressures. And this approach has ignored the intangible aspects of cultural regeneration. The government, bowing to the pressure from property developers, has been promoting the demolition of architectural landmarks, a tragic example being the Kinashish market, as we see in this image, to replace it with towers and large retail outlets. It is important to understand that colonial buildings are also part of Angola's tangible and intangible heritage and patrimony. Therefore, I highlight here the example of the disused cinemas, and especially the typology of open-air cinemas, which became very popular from the 1960s onwards. The first cinema to be built in 1932 was the National Cinema in Luanda, which we can see in this picture. It projected an imperialist architectural style and was frequented by Portuguese elites mostly. Years later, in the 1940s, the second cinema was built in a suburb of Luanda, the colonial cinema. This second cinema was intended to entertain the native Angolan population. So going to the cinema became a regular part of daily life for those living in Luanda. As already mentioned, from the 1950s, Portuguese architects began to develop a modernist architecture in Angola, and during this same period, the open-air cinemas began to be explored in the country. In general, they consisted of a huge roof covering the audience seating and a massive concrete screen set within a garden, along with other adjacent facilities, so people could enjoy food and drink while watching the movies. This type of structures were not originally designed in Angola, but proved very popular throughout the country thanks to the climate. The Miramar Cinema in Luanda was the first building of its kind to be constructed. Today it lies in a state of neglect. The Flamingo Cinema in Lubito is one of the best-known cinemas of this type, also today in a state of neglect. Generally speaking, the majority of cinemas across the country have been abandoned. During the colonial era these venues became very famous, spreading throughout the country. In Luanda alone, at least 35 cinemas were built up until 1925. Cinemas were places of social gathering. In interviewing some people, cinemas in Luanda up until 1975, we found descriptions of a daily habit of going to the movies in Luanda. What is known is that following independence and with the outbreak of the Civil War, economic instability and the imminent threat of urban attacks forced cinemas to close down one by one. Consequently, these buildings turned into ruins, and vegetation reclaimed enormous reinforced concrete skeletons. Given this complex interplay of factors, a central question arises. How can we today imagine, understand, and reuse these spaces, which are imbued with such a dense material and immaterial legacy? Looking at the skeletal remains of the open-air cinemas evokes what the French philosopher Georges Huberman, in his book Facing Time, defines as the anachronism of image and history. He says that the past returns not as a continuous line, but as a jolt, where images and structures do not belong to just one time. When we face the architectural structures that remains in Angola, we find ourselves confronted with a complex interweaving of times, and they become a collision of time frames. The memory of the colonial era, but they reshape the present once they remained, and the expectation for the future. The mistake in contemporary public policy and urban management has been to view these structures through a binary lens, either as old buildings to be demolished or as objects to be aesthetically restored from a Eurocentric perspective of static preservation. Or worse still, a renovation that strips the building of its character, applying a mask that doesn't respect the original design or the poetic effect of the time. An example of this approach is the recent renovation of the Studio Cinema in Namib. The construction of this iconic building began in the 1970s with its opening overlapping with the period of the war for Angola's independence. As a result, this cinema never opened its door, remaining abandoned for years until 2025, when government decides to renovate the building. The original design by architect José Botelho Pereira explored the elements and forms of exposed concrete, giving it the famous futuristic spaceship identity as it was known by the local population. When this building was renovated in 2025, in one hand, the use of the generic materials replaced the textures, the colors of the original structure. In other hand, by removing the physical traces of time, there is a break of connection with the generations who grew up seeing that concrete structure, which was very different in terms of material, forms, from everything else built in the surrounding area. So the discussions surrounding the reuse and reimagination of these structures in contemporary Angola requires to go beyond mere physical restoration. I believe it's necessary to adopt an adaptive architecture that transcends the material-immaterial dichotomy. In the case of the cinema, it is not just a question of restoring a 1960s cinema, but allowing these skeletal structures to understand the frenetic, informal, and inventive life of cities like Luanda, for example. What is also evident is that when there are no policies regarding the future of these buildings, people take control of the situation to meet their needs. For example, this cinema was transformed into a market that generates a lot of debate about it. But to conclude, the approach that the renovation in this specific case, I believe, is much closer to a hybrid adaptive reuse. And in this sense, the physical regeneration of cinemas will be entirely ineffective if it ignores their soundscape, emotional landscape, and cultural context, as well as that active participation of local communities. So, thank you.
All right, so our last speaker is Tanjina Khan, and the floor is yours, Tanjina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Federica, Mariana, and Mario, for giving me the opportunity to talk about a little bit of my PhD project going on in Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh, which is one of the most densely populated cities in the world, accommodating over 25 million people, is my hometown. And Uttara is where I live. What you see here is a small part of Uttara, one of the earliest and largest planned residential areas in the city. Uttara was originally planned in the early 1965s as a response to Dhaka's rapid urban growth and increasing population pressure. After the Liberation War of Bangladesh in 1971, this planned settlement became known as Uttara Model Town. It was designed for middle to upper middle income communities, a place where life would feel calm, quiet, and separated from all the noise and messiness from the city center. And you can really see that intention in these early plans. The grid is clear, measured, and almost absolute. Everything has its place, housing here, commerce somewhere else, a very modernist way of designing or planning or imagining a city. In many ways, this plan was a promise that urban life could be organized through order and stability. But Dhaka never really worked in such that way. The rhythms of everyday life kept changing, people adapted, Needs changed, functions overlapped, and slowly a tension began to appear between what the plan imagined and what life actually needed. Over time, many relatively new apartment buildings were no longer functioning only as housing. They were slowly accommodating offices, schools, clinics, small business, and other everyday functions. What fascinated me was that these buildings were not abandoned, unfinished, or architecturally poor in condition. Most were still ordinary middle-class apartment buildings, quiet, repetitive, and often visually unremarkable. Yet after occupation, they continued to change through small and gradual adaptations. And I slowly became curious about how and why these negotiated apartment buildings are adapting, and why it is keep happening, and what kind of architectural narrative begins to emerge from this. Hence, this research tries to surface those everyday yet often unrecognized layers of adaptation within formal architecture. Transformations we rarely acknowledge as legitimate design practice, perhaps because they have become so normal within daily urban life. While I was doing my fieldwork, I tried to speak with the immediate users, the people who are living through these changes every single day, people who took personal initiatives and did the adaptation, often without any technical experts. I wanted to hear from those who are directly using these adapted facilities in their everyday routine. I also tried to gather experiential reflections from those people who may not live inside these adapted buildings, but use it in some way. I found across primary, secondary, and even tertiary roads in Uttara, and almost everywhere in the city, a similar pattern begins to appear. Buildings originally planned, designed, and approved as purely residential are gradually adapting into commercial, institutional, or mixed-use functions. Some fully transformed, while others operate in more partial or negotiated ways. What is important here is that these are not isolated cases. They have become a common condition across planned areas of Dhaka, reshaping infrastructure, social life, and architectural practice itself. That is what led this research to explore how ordinary users continuously reshaped architecture through everyday adaptation, and what these practices might teach us about future architectural thinking, regulation, and sustainability. Although many roads were later declared commercial, most plots technically still remain residential. This creates a constant negotiation between formal regulations and everyday urban reality. While buildings can officially convert their occupancy status, the process is often extremely expensive and complicated. As a result, many residential buildings and their immediate surroundings gradually adapt into other functions through informal adjustments. We already have extensive scholarship in informality, but much of it is focused on informal settlement, public spaces, or governance structures. What remains underexplored is something far more ordinary: the quiet transformation of formally planned buildings, not slums, not exceptions, but everyday ordinary apartment blocks. Now look at this image. These are formally designed apartment buildings that have gradually adopted into a hospital and a school. While informality is widely studied, these everyday transformations within formal architecture often remained overlooked. Accessing these buildings for detailed case studies was also quite challenging for me. In many cases, I was not permitted to take detailed measurements or photographs. As a result, the research relied heavily on on-site sketching, careful observation, conversations, informal and formal, and post-produced drawings reconstructed from field notes and spatial memory. Over time, this constraint itself became part of my methodology, working with what was possible, rather what was ideal. Methodologically, this research combines field observation, walk-through, walk-around, interview, and importantly, drawings as a form of graphic ethnography. Here, drawings is not simply just representation, it becomes a way of seeing or tracing subtle spatial changes and everyday adaptation that are often easy to overlook. This paper, or my research, is only exploring 2 cases from all of my other cases. The first case is a 7-story residential building in Uttara. It was originally designed and approved as a fully residential building. 1 apartment per floor with ground floor parking, a typical middle to upper middle income group housing model. This very ordinary looking apartment building, like many others in Uttara, has gradually adopted from residence into office use. What I found particularly interesting is that it operates in a mixed mode, almost without changing any exterior thing, only interior. The first 3 floors functions as offices, while the upper floors remain residential. These transformations operated with no physical alteration. No walls were removed, no structural changes were made. The shift happened mainly in interior layout. These drawings shows how the transformation happened through everyday spatial reprogramming rather than major reconstruction. The structural system, walls, plumbing, and overall architectural layout largely remain intact. The building still looks like an apartment building, and technically most of the spaces physically remain the same. What changes is the way the spaces operate, function, furnished and used. For example, the living room becomes a meeting room, simply just replacing the domestic furniture with a conference table and other furnitures. The master bedroom transforms into an administrative space. A child's bedroom becomes a higher density female workstation. Even the residential kitchen and toilets are simplified and adjusted to support office use only. Originally, each apartment accommodated around 6 to 8 people max, but today, those same floors support 35 to 50 office users daily. So what actually changed? Not the plan itself, but the intensity, rhythm, and the pattern of use. And this leads to a key observation. The plan remains largely the same. What changed was the performance of the space. So the transformation happens less through demolition and more through reprogramming. In many ways, this shows how architecture can shift function very quietly through small and incremental adjustments, while the formal structure of the building remains almost untouched. When I spoke with the users, they shared very mixed feelings. Like on one hand, they were saying that they have not faced any security issues despite so many people are coming into the building in daily basis. But at the same time, they expressed clear discomfort, like the rent has increased because of the office use, social interaction with neighbors were very weakened. They also told me they would prefer to live in a fully residential building. So even within this seemingly smooth adaptation, there is tension between economic benefit and everyday comfort, between flexibility and a quiet desire for stability. The second case is a 6-story residential building located beside a neighborhood market. Unlike the first one, this building exists within an already active mixed-use environment. Here, adaptation follows a different logic. More likely a forced adaptation than willful. Lower floors became saloon and banking office. Upper floors remain residential. Ground floor parking is partially converted into shops, some ATM booths, and some pharmacy. It is more like layering. Multiple functions coexist with the same architectural shell. Before moving into the analysis, it is important to explain the surrounding context of this case, which has a very different influence on this forced adaptation. This part of the area developed during the earlier stage of Uttara, so the neighborhood had already evolved into a dense and active informal with multiple everyday functions. The immediate presence of the wet market gave the area an almost bazaar-like environment. At the same time, the adjacent secondary road connecting to the primary road of the wider Uttara community made this area even busier, gradually eroding the quietness originally expected from a planned residential neighborhood. Here also, the transformation is materially minimal, demolition of certain partition wall and reconstruct them for adapted merged spaces for commercial use, a sealed window for bank locker, rearranged interiors for customer service, etc. Yet, the building now operates simultaneously as a dwelling, a service space, and a commercial infrastructure, not through replacement, but through the layering of multiple urban leaves within the same residential layout. Here, the ground floor parking has been partially converted into small shops and ATM booths, reducing the parking space for residences. The justification given by the users were that many residents no longer use cars regularly, so the space could generate better income through commercial use. From my conversation with users and residents, it became clear that the surrounding bazaar-like environment had a strong influence on these adaptation, economic motivation, and the opportunity for easier income generation also played a significant role in reshaping the residential character of the building. Across the cases, three key findings begin to emerge. First, function changes without major change to the form, which means many adaptations happened with little or no significant physical change. Second, adaptation is often highly rational. It responds to vacancy, market demand, economic pressure, and the lack of everyday services. And third, formality and informality are deeply entangled. They do not operate as separate systems, but as overlapping and continuously negotiated realities. When I began this research, I carried a certain assumption with me. I already knew that Dhaka had long evolved through forms of adaptation, negotiation, and reuse. The rigid modernist grid was never fully our urban language. Adjustment and transformation have always been embedded in our everyday culture, behavior, and urban life. And yet, in the beginning, I viewed many of these unrecognized adaptations as problems that needed to be corrected. But over time, the research began to shift that understanding. This paper argues that the apartment buildings in Dhaka can no longer be understood as a fixed domestic type only. Instead, it should be seen as an adaptive urban format, a structure that exceeds the original designation and continuously absorbs the changing demands of everyday life. To theorize this condition, my research explores I'm trying to generate the concept of co-formality. Co-formality describes situations where buildings remain formally approved, formally designed, and formally legible, while their actual use is continuously reshaped through everyday adaptation, as in an adaptive culture. These transformations do not exist outside any formal system. They operate from within it. Architectural and urban debates often frame the city through a binary of formal versus informal. But what this research observes is not opposition. It is overlap, negotiation, and coexistence. Drawing from field evidence, the research proposes this co-formality as a way of understanding this living middle ground, where formal regulations and everyday practices continuously shape one another, gradually blurring the boundaries between formality and informality through daily life. However, co-formality is not purely beneficial only. It also produces tension. Residents often report reduced neighborly interaction, the gradual loss of domestic familiarity, the increasing rental pressures, and so many. At the same time, regulatory ambiguity, which is the very important thing, creates space for selective enforcement, uneven taxation, and opportunistic practices. So this condition is not simply about adaptation. It is also about constant negotiation. And most importantly, if architecture continues to assume fixed function while buildings themselves survive through adaptation, then perhaps what we are really designing is not simply form, but the capacity for change, what this research describes as a co-formal adaptive urban culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very graphic, rich presentation and very interesting topic. So I would like to invite Maria Patricia and Maria Tavares, and we will have probably Yolana online. I'm sorry, Yolana, that the time run off, but I was really interested in your association, the Banga Colectivo in Angola, and how it relates to this research on colonial cinemas, and also about how do you foresee the future of these cinemas?
Thank you for the questions. Just to say that my presentation was ending, so it's okay. The first question, the Banga Collective has an approach that starts from an investigation and research about the cultural aspects of Angola and how we rethink them today, especially or specific about the cinemas. This is a personal research. Actually, was my master from a master degree, and I thought that was interesting to bring it today. So Banga doesn't have a project specifically about the cinemas in Angola, but of course it's an interesting topic and matter, and it's what I'm trying to rescue today in the projects that are coming in Banga Collective. But about the future, I was saying in my presentation, I presented the example of Angola cinema that was appropriated by the population to meet their actual and urgent needs today. And I was saying that there is a general feeling of shame about the state of this cinema today. But what I'm trying to ask with my research is if it's is it the population fault, or maybe we have a lack of public policies to manage and control these needs of the population, and how we reuse these structures that are abundant and to respond to the necessities of population today. But what we see in the Angola context is that the government adopts an approach to always construct new buildings to solve some problems of the urban environment. So to resume, I think the future maybe lands in the academic approach more than interventions. In fact, I'm not saying that we don't need interventions. I think we saw that these interventions are not working in our contemporary context, And we have to have more theories about the contemporary architecture in Angola. And I think it is a huge lack today. So I would say that maybe the path goes through the research at first time.
No, thank you so much for your answer. All right, so let me give the floor to anyone. Yes, please, go ahead. And please introduce yourself and then, yeah.
Hi, my name is Marcela Aragüez. I'm assistant professor at University in Madrid. I have a question for Maria. Thank you, thank you everyone for your presentations. My question is for Maria. I found really interesting how the same architects were able to kind of react and adapt their own approaches to architecture to very different contexts through very different languages, or through those two very different languages. And I wonder if you were able, through your research, to trace whether the transformation of those housing developments has been different depending on the languages that those architects adopted. Perhaps, you know, to compare the more vernacular ones or more rural ones versus the more sort of high-rise urban ones. And whether these may have to do or not with the level of preservation or heritage protection that these developments have from any institutional body in the country. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to start saying that in this reservation, they didn't have traditional houses. They were all pre-Hispanic Spanish colonial houses. And this process of reivindication of the culture started in 1992, when in Colombia we changed the constitution. And since that moment, the indigenous communities were able to somehow to recognize again their culture. And in this community specifically, they're very powerful politically. So they try to show other communities, and also this community specifically, how to reconnect with their own roots. And the process that they did in this reservation was to go to other communities that they keep more influence of their own traditions, like going to the Amazonian, visiting the Amazonian indigenous communities, other communities in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is in the Caribbean coast, and they're very well recognized because they keep the traditions alive. So they start, since that moment, 1992, they start this political process of trying to reconnect with their own culture. So going, the elders and women and people going to those far places and to reconnect with a little bit of this indigenous culture, they went back to their own communities, like they went back to those reservations and they start trying to incorporate this traditional way of living into the modern reservations. So if you go to Toribío, the houses are like traditional, there are like a Spanish pre-colonial houses, like modern houses, if we can call. But what they did was to start building those traditional houses with traditional materials, with wood and bareque, and the shapes of the huts like you can find in the Amazonian areas, just to see and to show people that they still there, that the indigenous people is still in this territory. So that's what I mentioned, that each traditional house that is built in this territory is like a voice of recognized indigenous territory and indigenous culture. So that was at the beginning, that they tried to reconnect with their roots. But nowadays, what they do is that they do a lot of community work. Each house that it's created in this territory, it's a community work. People get together, people make designs, people talk about what they want, if they want a circular shape, or they want a rectangular shape, or they want an oval shape. So it's community. And for me, like, I'm not a part of the community, getting involved, it was very special because I was able to be part of this process. And not only me, but also my students and my colleagues, bringing students and learning from them, learning from their activities, learning in this community process. So I think that was the main important point in this process, that I was able to participate. And as I say, like in my last slide that shows an architecture, a thesis degree developed in this territory is that, no? It's like just to recognize that there are other ways of thinking, there are other ways to construct, there are other ways of build houses, there's other ways to see architecture. So I think this is the main, the main point of doing this. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maria Patricia. All right, so we have one last question for Tangina. I don't know if anyone has a question for Tangina. Yes? I'm sorry. So we can go. No, Benedetta, you can go. You can go. Sorry.
Okay, my name is Maddalena Ferretti. I'm from the Università Politecnica delle Marche in Italy. I'm an associate professor of architectural design. And I found your presentation very interesting, especially because it's somewhat a little bit the contrary of what we are observing in Europe in the moment. A lot of office buildings are currently transformed into housing. So I would be curious to understand a little bit more, if you can give us a little bit more information of how this process works in Bangladesh. And also, I was curious if you can explain us a little bit more on this co-formality concept, co-formal process, let's say, especially with regard to the legal framework in which these transformations happen. So is it that these transformations happen within a legal framework, or are they adapted by the inhabitants without no specific legal framework? So I'd be curious to, if you can deepen it a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena.
Thank you so much. Oh gosh, you just pointed everything out.
Okay, you have 2 minutes to answer.
Oh. All right, first, when I started my PhD, most of my friends and colleagues, we used to talk, right? So they could ask me the same question. Usually here, office buildings are converted, and we have a lot of theories, lot of books, lot of examples. But in other part of the world, majority of the world, it's different. Because I said at the very beginning, we are a very densely populated city. So residences are converting. Why? Because we are kind of not able to or providing enough amenities in the society. We need schools, we need clinics, we need other things. It's just not houses, right? We need to survive through all those other facilities. And when the planning system, the first plan system I showed, which is very modern style, there is no complaint. I am not here to complain. I'm just trying to understand. When you're not designing or for a predictable demography in 50 years, how much it will be, of course this kind of problem will happen. What is happening now? And again, I changed my mind to see it as a problem. So this is not a problem. This is an adaptive culture which is happening. And when we are architects, when we are trying to design it or reshaping it, we have to just we have to understand it, and we have to design in such a way so that this is a phenomenon. These people will eventually change it. How we can give them the authority, they can change. They do not need to always take the help from the practitioners or the professionals. So that's how so your first question, did I answer that? Yeah. And the second one you were asking about the LIA, yes, of course. That is, So that is the thing. The entire co-formality thing is going on, which I'm trying to still, no published paper yet, so I'm trying to frame it. It's happening inside a formal structure. I interview a lot of administrative people who are in the authority, who are taking the decisions, and they know everything. And it's something like an elephant in the room. We don't talk about it because even if we start talking about it, we have to take responsibility to figure it out or to fix it. It's not that they are not trying to. One of the reasons most of the people are in the administration that they are under people. They are not equipped enough. So they have their intention to do good things or do things in a right way, in a properly measured or accountable way, but it's not always the thing which is happening. So people are doing this. Sometimes, most of the time, it's not a formal way, but with the negotiation of the formal authority. And that negotiated for a platform, you can imagine. Legal, illegal, semi-legal. So that's how it's working. And that's why I am trying to frame it as a co-formality. It's not fully informal. People are not absolutely neglecting the rules and regulations. They are trying to find the gaps. So they are trying to adjust in between the formal in a kind of an informal way. So I'm trying to address it as co-formal.
No, thank you so much for your answer. I remember having a lawyer speaking in one conference, and he only had one slide. And he talked for 20 minutes on a slide. This is the advantage of coming to lectures by architects, right? We have a lot of images, and we have a lot of ideas, but I think that sometimes we kind of need that legal aspect. I was really thrilled once working as a consultant that we had an expert on the legal aspects of that particular place that we were working, and he was able to frame and to see that the Constitution was playing a completely opposite. It was a kind of, prohibiting that adaptation, right? So I think it's really important that we have that kind of, I know they are boring lawyers, but we really need them. No, I'm kidding. My parents were lawyers. So I would like to thank the speakers because we have been taking such a wonderful tour around the world, looking at different realities, looking at different problems in adaptability, different typologies and different problems and challenges. And I know that during the coffee break, you will have time to exchange with colleagues.
Well, so now for our first keynote, the Dean, Ron Miller from the Faculty of Engineering and Design is going to introduce. So please, Ron, come here. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Don't break anything. Dr. Wanda Dalla Costa is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in northern Alberta. Her firm, Tawa Architecture Collective, has offices in both Phoenix and Calgary. At Arizona State University, she's the founder and director of the Indigenous Design Collaborative, a community-driven design and construction program which brings together tribal community members, industry, and a multidisciplinary team of ASU students and faculty to co-design and co-develop solutions for tribal communities. Her teaching and research are focused on Indigenous ways of knowing, co-design methodologies, and the resiliency of vernacular architectures. Dr. Dalla Costa received an honorary doctorate in 2023 from Athabasca University in northern Alberta. In 2022, she was recognized as an honorary fellow of the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada. And in 2019, she was recognized as a YBCA 100 recipient by the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, a list which celebrates people, organizations, and movements shifting culture through ideas, their art, and their activism. Her work was featured in the Unceded Venice Biennale in Venice in 2018, which was curated by architect Douglas Cardinal. She was also the first Indigenous woman in Canada to become a licensed architect. It is my privilege and honor to welcome you, Dr. Dalla Costa.
This is the craziest introduction I'm going to make it shorter somehow. I want to start today, if you want to flip to the first slide. I hope I have slides here. I'm not going to be able to make it without it. Oh, here we go. I'm doing it. Thank you. I want to talk about a few key things today, but I think I have to start with the land. The land to Indigenous people and to me represents many things. What you're looking at is satellite Cree Nation. So this is a homeland. This is the field that we would burn every few years to restore the ecologies. This is the field where the water well was, where we would pull water outside of a well because mother had no running water. But that water was for cooking, for drinking, for washing clothes, everything you could imagine. It's also the field that grew the Saskatoon berries that we use for soup. And it was also the field that grew the strawberries for my entrepreneur aunt who had a little side business growing and selling strawberries, fresh, nice, organic strawberries. This is also the field that we would watch the Northern Lights from. I also was the field that was our playground, the land that was our playground. What you don't see are the horses that used to run on this land, and what you also don't see is the abundance of what I call field ornaments, the non-operational tractors, combines, and cars that were just strewn around my grandmother's property. It was a lot cheaper to keep them there than to haul them away. They were a part of growing up. This is also the land where we used to put a teepee. Those teepees, when we put up the teepees, it has so much meaning embedded in each of the teepee. I don't know if you know about the meaning of the teepee, but each of those poles, each of the 13 poles represents a value. So they each represent bravery, honesty, humility, sharing, generosity, like really beautiful. So every time you put up that teepee, you're reminded of those sacred values. The teepee also that we put up in this field used to share with us the sacredness of life. You know the story where they talk about using every part of the animal? It was really true. You didn't waste a bit of that animal. And that sacredness of life was embedded through the process of putting up that teepee, reminding us of the gifts of Creator. In that teepee, in that field, we would also learn spatial protocols. Where does the elder sit? Where does the grandmother be? Where is grandmother served tea? What direction do we enter from? How do we move in that teepee? We move clockwise, the same direction as the earth. Once you're inside of that teepee, there's an abundance of songs and stories. So this land, this field, this landscape was not just a piece of land. It was actually what we call a storied landscape. One in which every place has a range of stories and songs associated with it. The storied landscape, I've come to realize, gives a lot of meaning to this work because it really connects us to place, it makes us belong to a place, it increases our appreciation of the local contextual life of that place, and it reduces that abstraction between our body and the earth. So a simple structure, a simple field, but so much more. My grandmother's house, my mother's house, that was the replacement for our rich, wonderful teepee. The teepee teachings became less frequent, as you can imagine, only reserved for special occasions. And the home where my mother lived alongside her 6 siblings, this is where she lived before she went off to residential school. There is a funny story. They actually hid my uncle underneath the steps of the little home so that he didn't have to go to residential school, so he could actually stay and work on the farm. I know, little secret, don't tell anyone. But that house ended up being adapted over time by my grandmother. She ended up building, and I think this is probably quite common in rural environments, she ended up building a little cold room in the back, but it wasn't, I think, not your typical cold room. You know, in rural environments, of course, you always need that boot room because you've got all this outerwear and you need that sort of vestibule. But in this one, it was a little bit larger, and in there, she could accept a quarter hind of a deer. So there was a great big table in there that someone would come in and actually drop food for Grandma. She would also serve tea to the people that would come to visit her, and they didn't have to take off their overcoats. There was a little wooden bench that sat in this little shed, and she would serve tea in this little room. And then in there were two critical pieces in that room. There was a huge cast iron stove. I don't know where she got this beautiful old thing, but it used to serve 50 or 60 of us that would sit in this little 600 square foot home every Christmas, Easter celebration that we had. We were in this little house. There was also a spare fridge out there. So that made us able to live this little tiny shed. Over the years, she also adapted with a rain barrel and a window. And I used to always talk about the window because it was 10 years before the band actually put the window in. It took her 10 years, and she would be complaining every year that she had no window. Why do you need a window, Grandma? I need to see the visitors as they're coming up so I can put on the tea, warm up whatever food she had in the fridge to serve the guests in her little cold room. So the rain barrel as well that she put, and this was long before, this was like, I'm guessing 1970 that rain barrel was there, long before it became fashionable to catch rainwater. But she was using it to plant a garden, to water everything around her, to continue the life that she had in this beautiful field. The last alteration that I remember her doing to her house is that we had to pick up and move her house. A lot of clustered living is a really important form in Native American communities because the intergenerational ties stay together, but then you can also care for extended family in these type of arrangements. The government doesn't really think about it when they're planning First Nations developments, but I think the cluster model not only could be great for our reserves and for the people who live in our communities, but also for the urban cities. Like, we all need to get together more and be at one. So these clustered dwellings, we had a couple of those on Saddle Lake. We had one that was run by my aunt, the strawberry entrepreneur, and another where my grandmother and my Uncle Dennis used to live. And they were wonderful. They were welcoming, they were lively, they were full of life. And it was only because they decided to adapt the home, the little lonely home that was where my grandmother's property was, it was only because of her push to adapt the house to suit her. So I think as I was thinking about this conference and I was thinking about what I was going to talk about at adaptation, I started to realize how important grandmother's house was to the topic of adaptation. But I've also started to look at all of our work and I was like, my God, I think everything is an adaptation. Everything that we actually do, like, yes, we've renovated some buildings and that's what we know about adaptation. But I would think that most of the environments that we've had to create are an adaptation of Western norms in architectural planning and design, and we've had to adapt them to be inclusive to culture. So I think this, as much as I thought, well, what am I going to say at this wonderful conference that they're putting on, I start to realize that I'm not sure that there is a culture that has had to adapt more than the Indigenous culture in Canada. But what I think this reveals is maybe something larger, maybe two things. I think on one side, it really reveals that disconnect between the environment, the imposed architectural models, and the way Indigenous communities, cultural communities live. I think there was a disconnect. But I think it also reveals something also kind of interesting that as I was thinking over the last week, that I also think, well, maybe there's a path forward. We're doing a lot of explorations in our firm, through my practice and my research, the research at the university, but also in my personal practice. And maybe there's a path forward in this. So today what I brought a couple of models and frameworks that we use. And so I'm going to walk you through those. And then I'll share with you a couple of projects, our adaptation projects, which I think is everything that we actually do in our firm. But I brought a couple that were, I think, really strong examples of adaptive work. So I'm going to talk a bit about something called the Indigenous Model of Design. I'm currently drafting up a book for Routledge that is draft due in the fall this year. But it's all about a model for thinking about the norms and patterns that I described in the field, in the teepee, and in grandmother's house. All of those norms that we didn't learn about in architecture school. In anthropology, there's a concept called cultural ecology, which has been used to address the interrelationship between human, culture, and environments. To us, that's exactly what the IMOD is doing. It's an approach, an adapted design approach, a relational design analysis tool that centers Indigenous worldviews, centers the relationships to land, which I hope you understand how important that land is, centers the relationships between community members, so you can remember the clustering, and culture, while it also uplifts values, which I think you've seen I hope you've gathered through that outset, that the values such as the ecological connections, the burning of the fields that we used to do seasonally, or the collective identity that everyone sees on teepees, those symbols and those signs, as well as the intergenerational sharing and caring. It is supposed to do all of that. It should be able to do all of that, a model of design. And I think from looking deeply into what this could be, and these are the 5 categories that we're wrestling with right now, I think it allows us to really delve into what an architecture of adaptation is. So the categories on the screen, I've been calling each of these categories relational design considerations. I'm not sure if that's the name that's going to stick, but right now that's the best word that I can think of to describe these 5 bubbles. They're currently in testing mode. I found 2 scholars, a Hopi architecture PhD graduate as well as an Iroquois scholar, and they're testing this model of design with their traditional architecture of their home place. So I'm going to look at these each, and then I'm going to kind of reflect a little bit on the teepee teachings, grandmother's house, and the kind of how this has all come to be. And then I'm going to share a few of our adaptation projects from our firm, Toel. The first 3 relational design considerations that you see on screen are, to me, what architecture should respond to. These are really the main 3. The 4th one, and I'll explain a bit more later, I believe is one of the vessels that has to hold those 3. It's about how we project out into the world. The 5th bubble is about our process, how we do the work. So let's begin with land and nature relationships. Architecture expresses a people's relationship with the land, environment, and the non-human world, guided by principles of stewardship and harmony. When we created this category, we were thinking about how the built environment connects to people in relationship with the land. One of the things that I'm really been fascinated by is the theories of place attachment. I don't know if any of you have read place attachment, but there's like 6 or 7 levels of place attachment, all the way from being completely oblivious to a place to the highest level where you're willing to make sacrifices for a place. And I think I would love to get us all into that mode where we begin to think about Mother Earth in that way. But I think in this category, I think about, the teepee, and I think about my grandmother's house, and I think about the seasonal burning, and I think about the teachings of non-human life. All of these things from that form of the teepee that is such a thin separation from the exterior world, to the practices of, burning fields, to the teachings that were held every year around those teepees. All of this comes absolutely to life. The second category, which I also love, and we're starting to bring back in nearly all of our architecture. You think about, Machu Picchu and all of these old historic structures that have so much connection to sky science, other important factors in our universe. We're starting to integrate this back into architecture. And it's been pretty amazing. We're recognizing solstice, equinox, moons, suns, stars, you name it. We will put as much bling as we can into a project. Because I think the question that we're trying to ask here is, how can architecture support spiritual relationships? How can it support spiritual relationships? And I think, when I think about this second category, I think this is not unique to Indigenous cultures. I think there's a lot of cultures around the world that have increased their understanding of place through that understanding of the natural world and connecting through it. So I think there's a whole bunch in here. The third one that I bring forward is community and identity. And again, these 3 together are the basis of the system. And this talks about, and this one is so powerful, and when I started to go through all the projects over the last week that we've done at the firm, this is almost a priority in every one of our projects. I feel like we, in the Indigenous culture, we've kind of been separated, and I don't know, it just lost the cohesion that we had so beautifully back in earlier years. And so I think this one is really important for survival, resilience, continuity. This one is really critical. And this one category asks, how does architecture support collective life? That's a question, I think, for urban environments as well. How does it support our collective life and our sense of belonging, right? And I think about, you know, the social structures in our teepees, how we honor the elders. We still serve elders when we have a buffet. The elders are the first one to eat. We all run and grab a plate for our elders. There's all these sort of underlying norms that follow some of these practices that I think share something really rich that we could start to bring back. So these three together, the first three, are the relational design considerations, or what architecture should respond to. The next one I want to talk about is more, I think about this one almost as the vessel. As if I had one more day to put together the PowerPoint, I would have put those first three inside of this as a bubble. Because I think what this one talks about is really about what do those three things carry forward? What do they want to communicate? What does this talk about? How does this lead us into the future? And I think it's really important because design can really serve as a powerful vessel for oral history, for myths, for collective memory, and creating an architecture that becomes a storytelling, a story of a local place. Like I think about my grandmother's house and the field and the teepee and all the things that were there, and everything about it, from the house to the burn, to the tractor, to the horse, to the teepee, to the paintings, everything told a story, but it also held our collective memories together. It did two really phenomenal things. So the last category is really about how the work should happen responsibly. So again, if I had one more day, I would have probably added that as the second ring that encapsulated the first three, because it's really about process. And the question we ask in this regard is, how do we bring a responsible process to our work? And this is everything that you all have heard over the last 10 or so years as Indigenous design keeps sort of kind of elevating, and we're kind of bringing it to all of our urban environments across Canada. You know, it's about participation, it's about permissions, it's about accountability, it's about transparency. There's so many buzzwords that I think you are all very aware of. So I think this is really about how we do this work. So let's take this forward a little bit, and let's start to think about our projects that exhibit this notion of adaptation. The site for this project is not too far from here, about a mile or a couple miles from here. And it sits right across from the Parliament building. We knew it wasn't going to get built. It was more of a kind of a nudge to the Canadian government. They asked us to put together a kind of a feasibility study for an Indigenous people space across from the Parliament. So what you're not seeing, or I guess, let me first talk about what you're seeing on there. Can you see a shawl on there wrapping around the outside of that building? Do you see a shawl? Kind of, it's subtle, but there's a shawl there. For us, it's a sacred gift. It's about protection, and it relates to healing. So coming right across from the Canadian Parliament, this was an important message. There was also a fire that we put, a sacred fire, which represents truth. So we did it right across from the front doors to Parliament. It was actually spot on, directly aligned with a walkway to join the two, to bring the truth-telling to this. But the other thing that you'll notice on there is you see a number of, some people see feathers, some people see snowshoes. There's little kind of, a little bit of bling on the outside of the building, and we wanted to have individual representation by every community, Indigenous community in Canada, to bring their own bling to the building. And that was really about inclusion. So this project, you know, obviously you can see what we were trying to do is we were capturing the words of the communities we were listening to, and the narrative or the story that we were trying to put across, again, that was from the IMOD, number 4 on the IMOD, we were trying to put across a new future. We also included a number of urban gathering spaces in this project. And again, this is really about belonging, collective identity, which is connected to community identity in our iMod system. We've got an upper roof deck gathering place, but we've also got the sacred fire that sits directly across from the Canadian Parliament. Urban gathering places are so important to Indigenous people. 60% of Indigenous people now live in urban centers, and it's really important that we have places to gather because this is how our culture survives. So we need them in every city. I think the loss, if not, we're going to experience a whole bunch of loss without these. It's not just a dance, it's not just a fire. There's a whole bunch of things going on in that simple act. I bring another project from Ontario. This is Western University. We were helping renovate that round drum building in the far side that you see on the far left-hand side, but we soon realized after we talked to a lot of the students, the administrators, the elders, knowledge keepers, faculty, that the indoor spaces weren't enough, that they actually needed an outdoor place where they could bring other modes of teaching and learning to the students. So land-based learning is a very significant norm in Indigenous circles. And so going back to one of the iMod categories, land and nature relationships, it's all about teaching. So we have this massive garden. We dug a hole. This hole was not there before, this sort of descending garden. But we found the student space was at the bottom of this, and it was kind of dark and depressing, and there was no light. It kind of reminded me of U of A, my days back in the 90s at U of A, where we were in this tiny little room. I was first generation, so I was just happy to see other faces that looked like me. There were about 12 of us down in the basement. Actually, it was the 80s. What am I thinking? Yep, it was the 80s. Whew. And so that little depressing room, I thought, gosh, we don't want the students to feel that kind of, that one window that they can see the outside world. I said, let's just take a bulldozer and see if we can create a garden, bring natural light in to really make this land-based learning connect with the spaces that the students were already occupying. And you can imagine that once you have a center like this, right, it's just a ceremonial fire with a garden that the elders can teach through, but you could also have a lecture, but it creates a collective life for the Indigenous students. They're no longer stuck in this little room. They have places to grow and feel welcome on campus. So important when you're first generation. Some of the spaces that are inside that building, in the upper right-hand side, the students asked to be able to cook a roast together. So there's that, in one of the iMod principles, collective unity and belonging. That's what they wanted, to create that collectiveness. In the lower right-hand side, in terms of the identity, they wanted to project very important things, and that's a very important symbol to the people of that region. And so we used the symbols prominently. And then, of course, we had a lot of spaces for storytelling or people to come together. The second project I bring, or the third project I bring, is another Ontario-based project at Lambton College. And again, it's an adaptation because the university realized that in order to increase student success, they needed to do something different. The current classrooms that people were learning with were not cutting it. And during this time of doing all these university renovations, I read a really amazing paper. It starts with Weaving Sustainability. If anyone's interested in Indigenous knowledge, it illuminated 4 types of Indigenous knowledge, not just one. So the one, contemporary knowledge that you get out of a book, that's the normal one. But there's land-based knowledge, which is what these structures are based on. There's traditional knowledge, which is through storytelling, which again comes through these structures like this. And then there's empirical knowledge, where you get from revealed knowledge, that you get from just kind of meditating on the land, visioning, thinking, being with yourself and being by yourself. And those are the 4 different types of Indigenous knowledge. Why can't all of our campuses have those 4 types of knowledge? Right? And I think this is what we're starting to see, is a lot of campuses are starting to design structures. This isn't just for Indigenous students, it's for all students to come and take part in ceremony. But what I wanted to share about this project, and it's really about 3 or 4 of the iMod categories are completely embedded in this project. This is the most cultural bling we've ever been able to put into a building to date yet. But you can see from the diagram on the left-hand side, on the top level, you have the 7 grandfather teachings on each one of the petals, and we took the animal footprints It's in construction right now. I don't have a construction photo, but it's actually almost finished construction right now. But the little footprints that you see on the side of the building, those are the 7 grandfathers. And then the east door is recognized with the copper pedal, which again has significant meaning related to water and purification in the region. And then it has the cardinal constellations you see on the hexagonal structure, the octagonal structure, moon rings of the 13 significant moons of the people of this region. And on the spider structure, in between those, the structural wood, there's clan representation, so little, little abstracted symbols of the clans. And then finally, at the bottom, there's a ceremonial fire pit. Whole bunch of stuff in a tiny little structure, right? And it took us, you know, a couple of days in session with community members, 1 day of place-based research. That is it, to come up with a structure that I think becomes a teaching tool for the elders, right? Everything's there, very easy. I bring one reserve-based project that we did, Fort McMurray First Nation. This is one of the few reserve or reservation-based projects that we've done for this sort of creating this community and identity as a little landmark. But again, the purpose, going back to the IMOD, is really about collective life. When we built it, we didn't know what was going to happen in there. And within the first session, like, look at how active this space was, right? They knew exactly what they needed. We didn't have to think about anything. This one was just built also in Ontario. And again, this one really leans into cosmology and spirituality. Those are the 13 moon imprints that you see on the outside of that structure. It also leans heavily into that collective belonging aspect that is so important for our Indigenous people. And again, we never know how they're going to use this space, but they seemed to, that was the opening last week, and it seemed to go well. The last project that I bring for you before I get into, I want to delve a little bit into our Indigenous placekeeping framework, the deep process of how we do our work. I want to share with you ACT. This project, again, urban environment, we worked alongside KPMB for this project, and it came out that we were trying to figure out through the CMLC, the Land Corporation and Arts Commons, how we get people back into the theater. There was low participation to go to an urban theater. And so I had the fun task of going out to the urban Indigenous community and asking them, why don't they go to the theater? And you can imagine the answers that came up. One of the best, and I brought it straight back to CMLC and Arts Commons, I said, they think it's hoity-toity. That was the word for word, and I just said that, how do we make it not hoity-toity? So KPMB and our firm went down this pathway of trying to reimagine what a performing arts center that feels welcoming and inviting. And the concept that allowed us to think that way was the concept of a lodge. Not an Indigenous lodge, yes, of course it could relate to an Indigenous lodge, but I think a lodge is something that we're all familiar with. It's warm, there's a fire, it's welcoming, it's transparent, it's a beacon. And so that's really what we were trying to create with this structure, is kind of bringing that warm and easy feeling back to a building type that clearly needs a revamp. All right. So the last thing I want to share with you is really our process. This is the Indigenous Placekeeping Framework is a method that we developed to really find a way to do this work. I call it a living model because it continues to change every week. We're getting new information every month, every year. Elders teach us how we should be doing this work. We change the model accordingly. So just recently, for example, we realized that the second phase, that big engagement loop that you see in the second phase, is too much. People are drained right now from doing engagement. And we've since replaced that engagement phase with something called validation, where I say, let's not go in a room together. Everyone's exhausted. They're fatigued. They're not getting what, we do all these engagements and sometimes nothing gets delivered after all these engagements. You can imagine that the communities are not so happy about that. So they don't want to engage anymore, and nor do the organizations, the cities, the universities. Everyone's kind of pulling back, which I'm kind of glad. So we developed a new process called validation, and it's really just give us all your transcripts, meeting notes, past reports, anything that we can get our hands on. We'll analyze it, and we'll come up with a path forward that you either tell us we're on the right path, or we tell us to change it, or we change gears. So this 5-phase process, I won't get into detail, but this is the process that we've had to develop to adapt the process of architecture to create adaptive architecture. If I followed the traditional, do you remember in design school, they taught us of 5 steps for doing design, and the first one was have empathy. That's hard. That's hard. It's really hard. That's hard work. And I think that I've been critical of that process for many years, because I think there needs to be a bit more. What do you mean by have empathy? How do we get empathy in architecture? What do we investigate? What do we read about? Who do we listen to? How do we put people in a room? There's a whole bunch of things that we need to unpack with have empathy. And so this is the process we developed. A little bit of place-based research, a little bit of engagement or validation, collective design or collaborative design, and then at the end we celebrate and storytell, and at the onset we make sure that we have a really big startup process to make sure we're aligned, because the needs we're finding at the beginning of an architecture process can be really broad, create jobs in the community, or bring an artist friend that is amazing into the project. So there's very large list of needs, so that's what this process serves. This is what we're trying to interrogate right now. We're finding that a lot of stuff that's coming out and from those engagements, from our research, and so we're trying to codify this, and that the start of this was what you saw earlier, the IMOD, those 3 major categories. All of that, we're thinking, might fit into those 3 major categories in the IMOD. I wanted to share with you also a little bit of our place-based research. This is what we do in our second phase. Pretty simple. We take one of our design researchers, they take a couple of days, and they do research on 1 or more tribes, depending on how many nations are in a project. And through this, we used to keep this in our back pocket and not show anyone, but we realized that our communities kind of love to see this. They love that we went to the effort, even though half of it is going to be wrong because we got it from the internet or whatever other sources are out there. But it was really cute. They started correcting us and redlining our place-based research, which I actually loved. And so it actually started a really beautiful conversation that now to this day, we show our place-based research to our communities. The other way that we get information is a lot of coming together and having conversations. Now that we're switching to a validation model instead of an engagement model, will we continue to have these? I hope so, because they are just the best part of this work, is sitting in these rooms with groups of people to understand. This is another source of inspiration that we use intensely. As I was talking about the lodge concept that we used for the Arts Common Transformation Project in Calgary, this was the diagram that inspired KPMB. So this was when we started talking about the lodge and all the complexity that is a lodge. It's filled with tectonics and spatial implications, and there's a whole bunch of things that you can pull from Indigenous architectures. And so this continues to be an inspiration for us. Another source of information, which is also really critical to our work, is archives. We go into the archives. This is from Glenbow. We asked an Indigenous archivist to go in the back and I'm like, can you take pictures of whatever you can find? We're doing this Blackfoot-centric approach, and she came out with thousands of pictures that when we put these in a room with Blackfoot people, we were there for days talking, right? The stories, they just seeded all these beautiful conversation. It was incredible. So these are the 2 frameworks we're using, not only to adapt our process, but also to adapt the architecture that results of this process. And when I think about this, I'm so grateful for being invited, because it's allowed me to kind of think about what adaptation means in our communities. And I can't help but thinking that Indigenous environments have always been, it's always been about adaptability. The grandmother's home, the teepee, and the majority of all of our projects, grandmother, she's so amazing. But the majority of these projects supplement the Western prototypes and give us a cultural logic. But I do think it's broader than just a simple cultural logic. We're working on campuses, urban centers, and even the communities. And we've always adapted to what's there, right? Take whatever's there and adapt it, adjust it, rearrange it to make it more responsive. But I think they bring forward a really interesting and broader paradigm for the field of architecture. Yes, the envelope changes endlessly, right? That's what we do as architects, we change the envelope. But can those relational design considerations that are the root of that architecture, can those always guide the work? Can we make sense of that so that our architecture is more responsive? So with that, I welcome a conversation and thank you.
You stay there. I've been asked to moderate the questions, so I will stand over here and let Dr. Dalla Costa stand there. Any questions?
My name's Andrew Waldron, Carleton University. Thank you for the presentation. That was fabulous. My question is, do the other indigenous firms, Formline or Wampum or Two Row or whoever is, are they practicing the same model that you're developing? Do you know?
Not that I know of. I do know, I used to work for Alfred at Formline. It was my first job out of university way back in the day. And he did have a system, I think it was a 3 or 4 part system. I'm not sure if he still uses it, but I haven't seen any other systems be developed except for that early one that Alfred did. But I think, I'm guessing that my lived experience combined with the unique projects that we work on has created a pathway that is unique to our work, and I'm guessing that they could each create an equally powerful pathway, and I think you should all encourage them to do so. Let's get more of these pathways, because I think there's many ways that we could do this work.
Thank you for the question. Someone else?
Mine's just a comment. Tracy Lorio, Algonquin from Pequawknagan, and also working here at Carleton, and I just want to say thanks so much. Because, I didn't grow up in community, so I don't have all of this. And to be able to see these frameworks, really, thank you.
You're welcome.
Someone
You want to help me write my book? I need help.
Federica has a question here.
So thank you, Wanda, for accepting our invitation and coming to Carleton, which is really, I guess, the home of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Unceded Territory. And I'm very interested in your project, the Indigenous People Place.
Yep.
And this notion of wrapping, because it's very counter to much of how preservation has worked in the Western world. The idea of maintaining an image of a building rather than, this process of also altering that image and allowing for perhaps some healing processes. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more of the relationship between, I guess, the existing site, its history, and how the indigenous story is now retelling what the site could be.
That's a great question. And what I didn't share about the IPS project, many of you are probably aware it's a colonial building. It used to be the American Embassy. And it was Dave Fortin, Eladia Smoke, and I who were asked to do the feasibility study. And we literally shed many tears on our drafting boards trying to figure out how we were going to take a colonial building and indigenize it. It was like we tried everything. And then finally someone said, let's just wrap the whole thing. And fortunately, the walls, obviously, they're not functioning very well, and we would have had to add so many layers that we thought, well, thermal performance would actually be improved if we just wrapped the whole thing in a new layer. So that was the justification for that, but obviously we were aiming to create a new identity, but at the same time preserve, like a capsule, a history capsule, preserve that colonial form. We thought they were both important. And I think you see this a lot I've seen it with the residential schools that are peppered throughout reservations and reserves across North America. Some people want to just tear it down and never see it again. And then there's a school of thought that wants to preserve it and have it be a part of their history. So I sit on the side of, let's just leave it there. We got to remember, right? We were there, now we're here. So I think we should keep the innards and just remember what it meant. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, please.
Hey, thank you for the talk. It was very inspiring. I'm wondering if you could say something more about the spirituality bubble that you showed, and I'm very curious about the indigenous cosmology or spiritual beliefs or way of operating that affects and informs the way that you approach and understand the land and intervene there?
Absolutely, and I'll give you an example because one of the earliest projects I did was a little old school renovation. I didn't show it, it's 25 years old, and I did it in combination with, used to be LeBlanc, but they're Beckvale Architects in Alberta, and we were renovating a school, and we were working with a Blackfoot elder, and I told him that I'm interested in trying to uplift culture through this building, and he started drawing things on a napkin, essentially, and it was a medicine wheel with all of these teachings. There were so many lines and markings on there. Nothing was aligned to cardinal directions. Well, we did have a cardinal direction in the end, but there were so many other lines, including solstice and equinox. And when it came time to build that structure, the contractors called and said, oh, we're going to straighten out all these lines. We're going to put them all in order. And I said, wait. And this is, it made me think that we also have to teach everyone in the whole design process that's working on these projects. But that was the first example where an elder had taught me that a building could become a teaching tool. And he said, I won't teach you about it now. Wait till the building's built and come back and I will teach you on this medicine wheel. And it was at that point where I realized that the references that we included from solstice and equinox to Father Sky to animal prints of 7 grandfather teachings as wayfinding devices in the school to this complex medicine wheel with 1,000 lines in the room were all related to bringing that cosmology and spirituality into an early learning center, which is so important, right? Because this is where they're teaching our young ones, and this is where a lot of the culture is being lost, is in the early learners, right? They come off the res, there's no one teaching them anything about culture, and all of a sudden now there's a school with the room and the tracks and the sky and all of these references that can connect them and remind them of where they come from. So since then, all of the projects that, from the 13 moons that I'm trying to think what other references have related to the star maps that we put inside Lambton College on the ceiling. All of these have been requested for us to do because I think people see that we are very interested in cosmology and spirituality. Do I know all of the things that we're going to be able to draw over the next 20 years? I can't even imagine. I feel like we've just put one little drop in the water. And I think now that it's open, we are just waiting here for guidance on how else we could integrate cosmology and spirituality in buildings. But I love this part of architecture right now. Love it. It's so cool, right? Like I think about sundials and moon patterns and oh my goodness, there's so much, so much.
Thank you very much for the question. There's another question here.
Oui, Jean-Pierre Chupin, Université de Montréal. Thank you for this very beautiful presentation. And you have this incredible ability somehow to make non-indigenous people believe that they can actually understand and grasp the experience of indigenous. So I have a double question. So first, who are you writing for? Are you actually writing for non-indigenous? And if not, are you going to try to articulate, I come from a book culture, but as I understand, most indigenous nations don't trust the written word. So are you going to try to articulate the written word and the oral history somehow in a
yeah. Yeah, you hit this exactly. So the start of every chapter starts with kind of the story that I've shared here today about the land. It starts with the story, right? We have to start with the story, and then we get into the IMOD system, and the IPKF will be in there. But we're writing to practitioners. I'm not writing for academics. I love academia, not helping in our communities, right? All those theories and words and big words and all that jargon, not helping, right? Because they can't join us for this journey. So we've always had 2 languages, one for academia. I mean, I have to write alongside, how it goes, you have to write. But I think this book, and it was actually Routledge who pushed in this direction. They said, can you make it just for practitioners in a very accessible language? And I said, hurrah, let's go. So it will be for practitioners and for a non-Indigenous audience. Yeah, we're all about sharing. We have learning modules. We we give talks. We're starting an Indigenous design cafe in our firm in Calgary, in the office in Calgary. We want to have conversations, right? There's 20 of us. We cannot do this alone. We need all of the allies and the champions to join us in doing this work. So making it accessible is really part of the goal.
I really like all the process that you were explaining and showing, but there was one that I agree absolutely with you, what you were saying, that people, the engaging process. So, like the people are. So, do you have any recommendation on that? Like, through your process, how?
You know, I think...
Any advice?
Yeah. And you know what? We're watching this closely, right? Because it impacts this work so much. I get... It's terrible that our Indigenous communities don't want to engage anymore. Because, right, we failed. I failed. We failed. But what I actually think on the positive side is that I actually think organizations like municipalities, universities now have Indigenous advisories. And I think that's why part of the reason why we're not doing engagement anymore. That's actually a good thing. It's a really good thing. So is this an evolution of the field where we now have it embedded in our organization's capacity? Absolutely. And then they're not putting it on the architect to try and figure out how to make sense of all these things. I think it's a great pathway. So as much as we were disheartened by noticing the loss, there are still instances where we're doing it and we're being asked to do it, but I actually think it's positive that it's formalizing in our systems right now, which is great. But I am an optimist, eternal optimist all the time, so that's what I see. See the positive.
I'm not sure about the time, but I think we'll take this question here, this lady with her hand up, yeah. And then how much time do we have left? Okay, so this will be our last question, if that's okay.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. Berin Terim, I'm an assistant professor at Clemson University in South Carolina, USA. I wanted to ask actually about like an adaptation from the vernacular indigenous knowledge scale to actually larger urban environment scale, an adaptation of the, for instance, materials in that knowledge, like indigenous ways of making, building teepees, like the way that your grandmother did, but then the adaptation or the translation of that actually when it comes to creating larger scale projects and adapting it into materials that is actually industrially produced and etc. Like, can you reflect a little bit on that?
Absolutely, and I do believe that in urban projects or in urban, we do a lot of landscape-driven projects right now in association with landscape architects because we are finding that outdoor environments are ripe for bringing in Indigenous ways of thinking and sort of that identity making. And so we've worked with, SLA European folks from, European as well as local landscape architects and urban planners to create I don't want to say place making, I prefer the word place keeping moments within our urban cities. And if you can imagine these 5 components, you can imagine that if you were creating something in an urban environment that really prioritized place attachment and land and nature relationships, I mean, this would benefit us all. If you connected it to cosmology and spirituality, where we also became even more aware of all of the layers around us, fascinating, right? And then community identity, I mean, this is the heart from an Indigenous point of view. I'm talking about from an Indigenous point of view. We layer this in all of our buildings, but what is the collective belonging, collective identity of our urban cities, and how do we lift that up? I think of my husband's Swedish, and when we go to Stockholm, they have all these outdoor places in the sun that you go in the winter to sun yourself, like where the concrete gets hot and you kind of sit back and kind of sun yourself in these places. It's so quirky, but I kind of love it. And I feel like there's all these like human beings like sunning themselves on the concrete. That's kind of a collective identity. And so I think these can also be applied in an urban environment, quite honestly. And could we imagine kind of interrogating maybe this through an Indigenous lens and then adapting it to a Western lens or to whoever lives in that city, I think is possible. I do. I'm excited. Let's do one. Can we do a project like that? I want to do one like that.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for being a great and engaged audience. Thank you to our organizers for inviting me, because I had learned a lot tonight. And thank you very much, Dr. Dalla Costa.